Chapter 1941. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:08 and 25 seconds p.m. Chapter 1941. Long lost. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Anna's appearance caught the attention of the three archers almost instantly. As bowmen, it wasn't a surprise that they had sharp vision. However, what they didn't know was that compared to Lionel, their sight wasn't worth much at all. Although Lionel hadn't magically gained the Bao domain lineage factor after becoming a Bao sovereign, as the two existences seemed to be separate, the bits and pieces of it that he did have were perfectly intact, and his deeper comprehension of Bao force seemed to have a positive impact on them. Since he knew their location, he had maintained an eye on them from the moment he and Anna left their village for the final time. The eyes of the three narrowed. They were only scouts of the Constellation Bao Alliance. Their only job was to scout the region and find challenges. If they could be cleared, they would do so and return with the rewards. If they couldn't be cleared, they would return with a report. Given that this was a dungeon, it had to be reported no matter what. It was of the silver grade and had a 4-person entry specification, but they only had 3. They were supposed to mimic the zones a real territory would have to deal with in real life, albeit more streamlined and less involved. The 3 looked toward one another and seemed to make the decision at the same time. There was no other choice. The moment they saw the white lion Bao in Lionel's hands, there was always only a single choice. However, they didn't seem to have realized that the choice was never theirs to begin with. Anna seemed to flicker and vanished. All 3 reacted extremely quickly, pulling out their bows. However, maybe the greatest weakness for the archers in the air wars was that they couldn't bring their normal set of arrows with them. They had no choice but to use force in place of them. What they hadn't expected, though, was for their Bao force to suddenly stop responding to them at all. They pulled their bowstrings back, ready to attack, only to realize that absolutely nothing appeared. Their Bao force fizzled out like the last fumes of a dying flame. They were so shocked that they almost couldn't react in time to Anna appearing in their midst, swinging her battle axe with the moment of a dying sun. Crimson force blazed. Their blood boiled out of their control, and fear took hold of their throats. All 3 of them placed their bows out in an attempt to block, but Anna with her battle axe seemed to be on an entirely different level. Whether it was their bows or their bodies, they didn't last even a single strike. All 3 of them found their bodies severed at the waist. Their eyes still widened in shock even as they dimmed. Lionel appeared to Anna's side, looking down coldly. Trying to use Bao force in his presence? Wasn't that too foolish? With a thought, Lionel planted the 3rd outpost 10 kilometers out from the dungeon and returned swiftly. After this, he placed a hand over the 3 and extracted their souls just like he had for every other. But rather than using them, he simply stored them without the intent to use them. After a moment, 3 kill exchanges appeared in the form of 3 red orbs. This time, Lionel didn't ignore them and immediately used all 3. James, Emna and Alan appeared. Even after landing, the 3 didn't say anything, waiting for Lionel's orders. Alan, this is yours. Lionel brought forward a rail gun, an enormous one with a barrel that must have been at least 3 meters long. However, any engineer who had ever seen such a thing would notice the decided lack of engineering. In fact, it was overly simple, but that was because it could be. The magnetic ability index that would make it run would all come from Alan. There's an output 10 kilometers from here in that direction. It has the ability to sense anything within 10 kilometers of it. Any enemy that appears is yours to handle. Alan looked down at the railgun. It looked under-engineered, but the number of force arts backed into it that could help his accuracy and sight were mind-numbing. He was the only one of Lionel's brothers who had followed the Forcecrafter's path, so he knew well what he was seeing. Leave it to me, Alan said lightly, accepting another small device from Lionel. He raised one hand, and the railgun raised into the air under a mysterious magnetic force. With a jump, he landed on the enormous mechanism's back, and shot into the distance with wind-tearing speed. Lionel nodded and turned toward James and Emna. The 2 of you head out. Lionel tossed a pair of devices toward the 2. The segmented cube hadn't been working all this time for nothing. Clear as many challenges as you can. Kill as many as you can. If you find any other territories in the surroundings aside from in that direction, report it back to me. The direction Lionel pointed to was the direction Alan had gone in. That was the direction he speculated the 3 Constellation Bow Alliance members had come from, and that should be where the rest of the number lied. It wasn't that Lionel was scared Emna and James couldn't deal with them, it was instead a waste of resources because he alone was enough. Emna nodded. Working alone was what she did best. As for James, he too had gotten used to lone missions. At the same time, these 2 were among the 2 strongest under Lionel's charge. He could trust them to protect themselves and work alone. In addition, Emna and James were 2 who didn't need weapons to be exchanged for them. Emna's weapon was her body, and James had always relied on his energy shield ability index. They were the perfect 2 to bring out first. After a short exchange, Emna and James picked 2 different directions and rushed off. Lionel looked toward Aina and nodded. The 2 rushed into the dungeon together. From start to finish, the exchange had taken not even a single minute. Even now, as he pulled the distance between himself and others further and further, Lionel didn't have the time to waste. Well, there was one small moment of time wasted, and that was when he looked up into the skies with a cold glint in his eyes. He didn't need to say it again as his previous words were only continuously echoing in their ears by now. The Constellation Bow Alliance ancestors had all stood to their feet, their fists clenched and their hearts stuck in their throats. If they had denied it before, there was no denying it now. They had hoped it to be a trick of the eye, a combination of bow force and light force, maybe the influence of the spear domain ring, but now there was nothing before them and the truth. How did Lionel have access to that level of bow force? That long-lost bow force. That bow force no human had had access to since the loss of the bow domain ring. Chapter 1942. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 1942. Earth Dragon. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina sped into the dungeon. Dark cave walls loomed over them, and an almost suffocating stench of earth filled their nostrils. The dampness and humidity made it difficult to breathe, the ventilation of the dungeon not seeming great at all. Lionel could immediately tell that their target weren't humans, however he didn't seem capable of pinpointing the exact race either. Something that made him narrow his eyes. It seemed that Ancestor Hito had gone out of his way to pick more obscure targets, just for the sake of maintaining the usual randomness associated with zones. First there were the trolls they had faced earlier while claiming the village, now this. Thick earthy smell, high humidity, low visibility. Lionel thought of several possibilities before he narrowed it down to one. 76% possibility, this is an Earth Dragon den. Earth Dragon, while was the official name of this species, wasn't to be taken literally. Most accurately, they were a type of Earth affinity centipede with the legendary ferociousness of dragons, and they were notoriously difficult to handle. They were adept at causing land fissures and earthquakes, they could easily collapse a cave of this caliber, and they could chew through most metals as though they were nothing but thin films of paper. In addition to this, they could hold their breath for weeks at a time even as newborns, and their body temperatures ran so hot that their roars gave off the illusion of fire breath. In reality, though, it was just that their digestive system was so powerful after countless evolution cycles of burrowing through the earth, that if they opened their mouths up to the world, everything in their path would be scorched. The good news was that Lionel had an excellent earth force affinity that could somewhat counter these beasts. The bad news, however, was that their breath had nothing to do with fire force despite the heat, making it difficult for him to counter unless he had some sort of cooling measure. Of course, Lionel would still be resistant to the heat itself, but there was little he could do from an actual preventative standpoint. In addition, even his earth force affinity might not prove to be as beneficial as one might hope because the earth dragons were less focused on manipulating earth as opposed to devouring it. Earth dragons, Lionel said lightly. Aina didn't need any more explanations after this. While it had seemed that the two had been in here for a long while already, the reality was that they had only taken a single step. Before their second steps even landed, Lionel had already spoken his conclusion. His mind was simply that fast. In response, their roles shifted. Rather than taking the vanguard, Aina fell back and allowed Lionel to cross in front of her. She strapped her battle axe to her back, and took out a twin pair of silk cloths that danced up her wrists and forearms as though they had minds of their own. At the same time, two gourds she had had by her waist opened up, and large amounts of blood began to pool out from her sides. At the same time, Lionel's body glowed with an earthly, menacing air. A 3-meter-tall panda construct took form around him, but just as quickly as it appeared, a divine armor appeared and slid into place. By the time Lionel had taken his 5th step into the cave, an enormous 3-headed, 6-armed, armor-covered behemoth had begun to stomp forward. Lionel's new comprehensions in Earth Force hadn't just come with mental changes, they also manifested physically. For example, he could now use his dark gold panda construct and his divine armors at the same time. Earth Force was an extension of his life. His panda construct was just as much a part of his as his divine armors were. Why did they have to be used separately? Lionel unleashed a roar as his 3 vital stars appeared to his back. Aina was completely obscured, but that was exactly the point. He stomped down on the ground once and the earth trembled. The earth dragons had yet to be alerted as they had hardly moved very far into the cave. In fact, it was only now that the entrance vanished behind them, locking them into seeing this dungeon all the way through. But before that, the two took the initiative. Lionel's 6 arms punched into the ground beneath him, roaring as he lifted as though he wouldn't be satisfied until the whole world was above his head. However, it very quickly became obvious that this wasn't a piece of earth at all, and what Lionel had grabbed was actually the head of an enormous beast that must have been at least 20 meters long. Even so, Aina didn't seem surprised. She reacted just as quickly, the twin silk cloths on her wrists suddenly becoming coated by blood as she launched them both forward. The head of the earth dragon was pierced through, and its blood was quickly drained. Lionel tossed it to the side and charged forward. He punched walls, ceiling, and the ground. Every time he did, he ripped out another earth dragon, stunning them into place while Aina finished the job. Despite the fact that this wasn't the normal mode of their teamwork, their efficiency was no less great. With a combination of his Earth Force affinity and sensory abilities, Lionel was able to find the Earth Dragon before they could launch their usual sneak attacks. At the same time, he clamped their mouths shut, stopping them from using their strongest ability, while also crushing the antennas that worked as their sensory organs. When that was done, it was child's play for Aina to sever their lives, and it only got easier and easier as she accumulated more and more of their powerful blood. They tore through the levels of the dungeon, and eventually reached the final ground floor. Steam billowed toward their faces, the sheer heat making what should have been the hard ground around them feeling gooey and soft to the touch. Every step they took left another sizzle as an earth dragon that must have been at least 50 meters tall snaked into the air, its hundreds of legs shimmering like steel blades. Chapter 1943, published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 1943. 3. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again PCHU. Lionel roared, grabbing 2 sides of a large wound Aina had caused in the boss earth dragon's head with all 6 hands. Vital star force rushed out from his divine armor as he flexed, pulling with all the force he could muster. Blood and bone flew as the earth dragon was torn in 2 from head to tail. Bang! Lionel landed heavily on the almost molten ground, exhaling a breath with a sharp and cold gaze. He dispersed his panda construct and his divine armor, his breath turbid and steaming. Aina appeared by his side, and he placed a hand on her shoulder, causing a bubble of cool air to descend and envelop her. The steam increased, but Lionel had already moved forward, reaching the final altar of the dungeon, and waving a hand. Lionel waved another hand, accepting the rewards. For a dungeon like this one, a perfect clear condition would probably relate to clearing all of the earth dragons in addition to finishing within a certain time. This was a silver grade dungeon, so although the clear reward was air grade, it probably wouldn't be too exaggerated. The reward was twofold. The first was the point reward, which was 270,000 points. The second reward was a one-time use item that came in the form of a glass orb with the phantom of an earth dragon within it. From Lionel's understanding, it was a terrain shift reward. He could change one thing about the landscape of his territory within certain limits. He did a few calculations in his head when he saw this, comparing and contrasting his ideas with the limitations stipulated in the fine print. After a moment, he nodded to himself. It was feasible, though only in part. What was more important, though, was the added effect that came with implementing this change in the first place. The shaking of the earth that supplemented the change could be both a negative and a positive, depending on how it was used. Lionel thought of some possibilities before storing it away. With a nod toward Aina, the two left the dungeon together. "Where is it, Alvaro? Explain yourself." The fury of the Constellation Bow Alliance ancestors seemed to have reached a fever pitch. The only conclusion they could come to after all this time was that the Morales family had somehow gotten their hands on the Bow Domain ring. Nothing else seemed to make sense to them. They had never heard of the so-called sovereign moniker, at least not in regards to weapons. This was a relatively new concept that had only been introduced by some who had heard of it in the Cataclysm Zone. This conclusion seemed to make sense to them as well. Velasco spent a lot of time venturing outside of the human domain. If there was anyone who could reclaim that treasure under their noses, it was him. And if he had done so, who else would he give it to if not Lionel? Wouldn't that also explain why the White Lion Bow had never followed any one of them, but so obediently followed Lionel? The truth was that the Bow didn't listen even to Lionel's mother. She had given Lionel the Bow hoping that it would acknowledge him in the future. And it was a surprise to her that it did so immediately. If even Eleanor, who probably believed in Lionel the most of anyone in existence, was so surprised, how could the Constellation Bow Alliance possibly accept it with open hearts? In the moment, it felt like they had finally gained an explanation for something that had been tearing into their souls for the longest time. The Morales ancestors frowned, not quite knowing what Ancestor Mito and the others were even referring to. It seemed that every action Lionel took only increased the tensions in the surroundings further. First, Ancestor Gold Dark accused them of being far too ruthless. And now Ancestor Mito and the others of the Constellation Bow Alliance were up in arms. Don't pretend to be ignorant. The Bow Domain Ring. Where is it? The eyes of the Morales ancestors flashed. Was this what they were talking about? They put together the Vanishing Bow Force and the Golden Bow Force Lionel used, and understood why they had reached such a conclusion. But the result of them comprehending this was them bursting into a fit of laughter. It was uproarious, arrogant, and filled with complete disregard and uncaring derision. Ancestor Mito was so furious that steam truly began to come out of the top of his head. One would have thought that this was a ridiculous exaggeration of an old-school cartoon. However, the bodies of such experts could react with just as much exaggeration. When an eighth-dimensional existence was enraged, the environment had no choice but to react. "Let me ask you something, Mito." Alvaro's voice boomed. Even if the Morales family had gotten its hands on the Bow Domain Ring, what would it have to do with your alliance? The booming shockwave of Alvaro's voice drowned out the voices of rage, his own malevolent expression seemingly not losing out in the slightest. It seemed that he wanted to slaughter the Constellation Bow Alliance members even more than they wanted to lay hands on him. There was nothing he abhorred more than hypocrites, and he hated weak hypocrites even more. If you were going to be hypocritical, the least you could do was not be on your hands and knees asking for handouts while you did so. Your families lost the Bow Domain Ring to the spirituals all those years ago, causing the human domain to drastically weaken. Your Terrius family went from a top dog to a piece of trash with no other choice but to form an alliance in hopes of maintaining your former prestige. Now you want to come and bark in front of me? Tell you what, if you dare to take 3 spear strikes from me right this moment, I might dignify your question with an answer. Chapter 1944. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 and 24 seconds p.m. Chapter 1944. Kill if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Ancestor Mito was so enraged by these words that his palm flipped over to reveal a shimmering black bow. But at the same moment that he acted, Alvaro had likewise taken out his bronze spear. It looked as though this was what the latter had wanted from the very beginning. Why did those little brats get to have all the fun? He wanted to let the world see his sharpness too. Everyone, let's calm down. An ancestor by Mito's side pressed down his hand before he could raise his bow and take a step of no return. This isn't what today is about. Let the kids handle this matter. Alvaro snorted. Pretentious pricks. If they didn't feel the fire in their bellies anymore, they could just say so and off themselves. What good was pretending to be high and above it all when all it did was dull your blade? There was a reason the Morales were the strongest, and there was a reason it would stay that way. Leonel and Aina exited the cave. There was an immediate choice to be made. They had enough for a promotion to silver grade now, but there was a threat to their side, and it wouldn't be long before they realized that 3 of their own had died. This should have been a difficult choice to make, but Leonel didn't seem to pause his steps for even a moment as he shot in the direction of the village. Boom, boom, boom. Despite the loud booms to his back, Leonel still didn't turn back, continuing to run in the opposite direction with Aina. He had left that matter to Alan, and he had already calculated that Alan would be able to hold on. When this matter was concluded, their advantage would only increase further. Alan stood at the top of the outpost, his eyes sharp beneath his glasses. He held up the massive railgun, his eyes locking onto a group in the distance as he unleashed another barrage. Before the shot even landed, his muscles flexed and his hips pivoted, swinging the railgun in a completely different direction as he unleashed another barrage. No one could seem to enter within a 10-kilometer radius of this region without being blasted to smithereens. Most managed to dodge and save their own lives. However, the first few had been greatly unlucky, losing their lives almost instantly. Leonel checked his kill exchange counter. After almost 2 hours, it had climbed to 11. This couldn't be considered too great or too small. The moment he and Aina made it back to the village, as they rushed into the central console room, Leonel began to exchange for more people. He brought out his 7 remaining brothers, in addition to Elther, Sale, Raylion and Hephaestus. When they appeared, everyone already seemed to know what they needed to do. They rushed to the walls just as Leonel exchanged 20,000 points to complete the improvement to silver grade that he had wanted. After the moat was formed, Leonel exchanged 50,000 more points and triggered the silver grade upgrade sequence. He and Aina, likewise, rushed to their positions on the wall, their gazes cold. This brat continues to overestimate himself. Mito spat coldly. His temper was only becoming more and more frayed as he watched a single Alan hold back the young geniuses of his Constellation Bow Alliance. The only thing that gave him some reprieve was the fact there was no way he would be able to hold out for long. Soon, very soon, Nazag would be alerted to this matter, and this farce would end. At the same time, this Leonel would likely bury himself under his own foolishness. There was a reason there was such a large leap in price between the bronze grade and silver grade upgrade challenges. One was supposed to have a large group of subordinates out by now, at least a few hundred. As time went on, more wild challenges were supposed to spawn, and barbarians of sorts would begin to appear in the wild, making accumulating kills and gathering more subordinates far easier. Right now, they were just at the beginning of heirs claiming their first territories. Leonel was the only one with a bronze grade territory in the first place. Being greedy and trying to push for a silver grade now was the epitome of foolishness. There were only 121 in the bronze grade wave, but there would easily be 100 times that in the silver grade wave, on top of the fact they would all be silver grade threats as opposed to bronze grade threats. Leonel had already sent away his most powerful combatants. His most powerful ranged specialist was tied down by the Constellation Bow Alliance. And now he was going to try and challenge a wave of thousands with just over a dozen. If this wasn't foolish, what was? Silver grade walls weren't nearly enough to offset this kind of danger. However, this wave would leave nothing more than silence. Leonel stood on the walls as the ground began to quake. Large dust clouds appeared in the distance as the sparse trees began to fall one after another. However, Leonel only calmly held his bow before him, not making a single move just yet. His gaze was the picture of perfect calmness, his hair swaying ever so gently in the wind. Menacing creatures appeared in the surroundings. They wrapped around the city, hooting and hollering, their weapons clanging. 3. The rumbling ground threatened to split as it whined and gave way. 2. Leonel could see the faces of the front line clearly. Even if he had been in the third dimension, he would have been able to. Those menacing tusks, that dripping saliva, those blood-caked machetes. 1. Leonel tapped his waist, bringing out a small orb with a writhing earth dragon within. 0. He dropped it to the ground. The moment it collided, everything seemed to change. The city, which had been on perfectly flat ground, began to rise up. The jagged edges of a mountainous region began to take shape, the water of the moat spilling over. The ground quaked and split. What had once been the intimidation of the enemy became their nightmare. Some fell within fissures, others were crushed by falling rock, and yet others found themselves wading in waves of water coming from a moat that seemed much too deep for common sense. At that moment, Lionel took out 3 more orbs. These were none other than the 3 irrigation rewards he and Aina had gained clearing challenges. As their village rose on the back of a growing mountain, lines of rivers began to appear, flooding the region with more and more water. The creatures that weren't crushed by rocks suddenly found themselves being drowned one after another. The result was absolutely devastating. By the time Lionel and the others stopped rising into the air, the army of thousands had been reduced to a few hundred. "Kill," Lionel said lightly, raising his bow. Silence fell over the human domain once more. There was nothing to be said, nothing that could be said. It was a sweeping victory. Lionel, however, didn't seem to care very much. The next order of business. Crushing the Constellation Bow Alliance. Chapter 1945. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 and 23 seconds p.m. Chapter 1945. 10,000 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The now Silvergrade village sat atop of a mountain, hidden deep within its sharp canopies. This mountain wasn't of exaggerated size. This made sense considering it was a reward from a Silvergrade dungeon, although it was granted as the highest level prize. As such, the mountain itself was only about 500 meters tall at its greatest point, which was relatively short even for a third-dimensional world. Even so, it had become a nightmare to attack. The pathways of the mountain were a combination of crisscrossing rivers and narrow walkways. Attack in large numbers was almost impossible. It was probably easier to just try to raise the mountain to the ground first, but even getting into position to do so was a nightmare as well. Because Lionel had activated the Earth Dragon dungeon reward before the trial was completed, there was the added benefit of the Silvergrade walls being reconstructed with the new terrain in mind. This might seem like a small matter, but now there was a wall that snaked around even the unpredictable terrain of the mountain. And around there was a much deeper and thicker moat. The village had become a beacon in all directions, making their location clear and obvious. But at the same time, it became a region that was near impossible to actually attack. Lionel descended from the walls and waved a hand. In this challenge, they had 13,138 kill exchanges. Without hesitation, he used 10,000 of them. Then he traded in the remaining 3137 Silvergrade kills for 3,137,000 points, as every Silvergrade kill was worth 1,000 points. The Gold Grade upgrade would require 500 million points to trigger, so they were still an enormous distance away. However, these 3 million or so points, added with the 200,000 points he had yet to use, weren't entirely useless either. Much like Lionel had been able to upgrade the walls after they reached the Silvergrade, he could now pay to upgrade other facets of the city now that it was also in the Silvergrade. After pouring another 50,000 or so points into the segmented cube to give it more raw materials, Lionel began to buy the upgrades he had had his eye on. By now, he had already cleared away all of the raw materials he had bought ahead of time, and could outfit everyone with what they needed given another half day or so. As for the upgrades, he focused on 2 main things: more outposts and larger territory. After reaching the Silvergrade, the range of the city went from a radius of 50 kilometers to 100 kilometers. Lionel doubled that for 500,000 points, then doubled it again for 1,000,000 points, giving them a 400 kilometers, which was already a 100 away from the range of a gold grade city, which was probably why he wasn't allowed to double it again. Finally, he bought the highest grade outposts that he could, spending the rest of the over 1.5 million swiftly. Each cost about 100,000 points each. He bought 16 and dotted them around the territory. The difference between the 50,000 point model and the 100,000 point model was nothing on paper. However, in the fine print, it made it clear that the highest upgrade was linked with the city. meaning when the city entered the gold grade, so would they. This would allow teleportation function between the outposts, making the doubled price more than worth it. Of course, for most others, they wouldn't be able to swallow this cost so early on, and by the time they wouldn't want to lag behind and waste time accumulating more points just to have upgradable outposts. Lights began to flash, and one after another, thousands of Lionel's warriors began to appear. Very quickly, it became obvious that not a single one of them was human. They were the Oryx. Much like everyone else, the moment the Oryx appeared, they were perfectly organized. They didn't say anything, they didn't waste time looking around. They simply filed themselves in an orderly line and waited as Lionel handed them their equipment one by one. Even with the sheer number of them, in just a single hour, they were already finished. Each Oryx was outfitted with their weapon and armor, shimmering with a black luster beneath the slowly setting sun. The more the elders on the outside saw, the more sure they were. Lionel had truly planned everything out from the very beginning. He had never left a single thing to chance, and his people were just as prepared as he was. Watching him as he steadily pulled away, the solemnness of the others only became more and more obvious. Lionel waved a hand and motes of force arts formed in the skies, snaking around until they formed a roaring violet-scaled dragon that soared into the skies. By his side, there was no one else but Aina, the only one worthy of standing by his side. On the ground below, Elther stood at the helm of the Oryx army, a massive black saber resting menacingly on his shoulder. Lionel's brothers and the others stood on the city walls. They wouldn't be participating in this expedition. The city had reached a point where it needed others to stay back and protect it now. However, they didn't seem worried in the slightest, and why would they be? Lionel strapped the white lion bow to his back. We move. The silence of the human domain was heavy. It felt like Lionel wasn't marching toward the Constellation Bow Alliance, but rather toward them, their own homes, their worlds, ready to snatch their hearts. Looking toward the cobbled-together resistance of the Constellation's Bow Alliance, the hearts of Ancestor Mito and the others sank. Lionel had gone from having the fewest subordinates present, to suddenly having the most by far. What chance did they even stand? Ancestor Mito gripped the railings of his flagship, twisting the tough metal as though it was made of thin aluminum. Nazag, we can only rely on you. Chapter 1946, published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 1946. Fireflies. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The Constellation Bow Alliance was quite spread out. Although they had sent many, they could only enter in pairs of 2, and each family only sent a single representative. However, among the devices they prepared to exchange for once they entered, there were communication devices that would make their coming together much simpler and easier. As such, by the time the first day of the air wars began to wane, there were quite a number that had come together. When this number was combined with the number they had exchanged for through their kills, they were slowly approaching nearly 1,000 members. However, what was especially ridiculous was that they couldn't cross into a certain territory. In the beginning, they had only sent 1 or 2 at a time, trying to see if there was a path to sneak in. However, those that were luckier were quickly forced to retreat under a barrage. Those that were unlucky, however, directly lost their lives. The only option seemed to be to move forward with a larger group, but it was difficult to organize such a thing without a sure leader, and there was only one person who would take up such a role. As the day waned, Nazag finally appeared. A group of elites of the Terrius family followed close behind him. They seemed to have already been outfitted with all of their equipment, and among this equipment there was what they had lacked the most: quivers and arrows. Nazag frowned when he saw the state of his people. Lionel wasn't the only one who could plan ahead. The original intention of the people of the Constellation Bow Alliance was to gather together as quickly as possible. In the meantime, Nazag would form an elite team and clear as many challenges and gather as many points as he could. In his absence, his people were meant to capture a village and then quickly clear out the territory, so that when he came with enough points, they could directly challenge the bronze grade and take a step into it as swiftly as possible. Nazag's strategy wasn't bad. Not wasting his time finding and claiming a territory maximized his skill set, And after a day, he had already accumulated several 10,000 points, and he was already close to having enough to trigger the silver grade challenge. In his estimation, by midday tomorrow, they should be firmly entrenched and they could begin using their silver grade territory as a springboard to attack other territories, expand and gather more wealth, resources and points. Everything should have been perfect, but Nazag, we weren't able to clear out the entire territory. Every time we try to go in that direction, we're barraged by a long-ranged weapon. 6 of our brothers and sisters have already died trying. There's definitely another territory over there, but since the plan was to clear the region first, we couldn't make the decision alone. Nazag frowned before making a prompt decision. Everyone gather. Organize yourself. We will attack now. There's no time to waste. Nazag had a bad feeling. An enemy that could set up such a thing so quickly wasn't a joke. The fact that 6 had already fallen on just the first day was also a hard pill to swallow. There were just shy of 1,000 of them, a casualty count of 6, not even mentioning the number injured, was already too high. The Constellation Bow Alliance quickly formed up, but before they could even set out, there was a sudden shout. Leader! Leader! A large army has entered the range of our territory. Nazag's frown deepened. I didn't tell you to start the bronze grade upgrade yet. What are you doing? No. There's Dash. Before the voice could finish, the darkening skies were suddenly enveloped by a violet brilliance. Roar! A streaking arrow of fire descended from the skies. It was just a single line of red, splintering the black skies in two. Even so, it felt tiny and insignificant. Until it hit the ground. Boom! The fires raged, shooting up into the skies and forming a pillar of devastation before a rain of flames fell from above, immediately turning the surroundings into a hellscape of heat and agony. Nazag's pupils constricted, and his vision sharpened, streaking across the skies until it landed on Lionel's face. His heart skipped a beat, his gaze shifting down to land on the army of 10,000. No matter how hard he thought, he couldn't fathom out Lionel had already gathered so many subordinates. But even more importantly than that, how were they all wearing such armors already? All of those armors were silver grade at worst. To trade for that, it would take 100 points each, one for the armor, and another for the weapon. That was 200 points per person. For 10,000 people that was 2 million points. That was simply impossible. When Nazag saw that many of the weapons and armors were actually in the gold grade, his face went completely dark. Could it be that the Morales were cheating so boldly under the eyes of everyone? There was already no more time to think. Ready your bows. We must use our advantage while we can. Ready and aim. Fire. Nazag had already organized his people for battle. In this relatively flat and dry terrain, there weren't any obstructions to worry about. Even if their village was burning to the ground, so what? So long as they could get off 3 or 4 volleys, this battle would quickly become manageable. The Oryx were on foot, so their charging speed was relatively slow. In addition, there didn't seem to be any shield warriors, or more importantly, platoons among them. Without a collective effort to shield against their arrows, they would have to fend for themselves. That would cause their formation to collapse and make them easy pickings. Nazag thought through things swiftly and then lifted his bow, ready to fire. The first volley launched into the skies like fireflies sweeping through the night sky. But to their shock, their lights suddenly flickered and vanished as though swallowed into the belly of a black dragon. Chapter 1947. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 and 20 seconds p.m. Chapter 1947. Not worth anything if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The violet dragon snaking through the skies suddenly whipped its tail, causing the few arrows that had been launched into the skies to snap beneath the wind pressure alone. Nazag's eyes widened in shock. His first thought, once again, was some sort of cheating. This was a world created by a Morales ancestor, after all, and it was designed to distort their senses from the very beginning. Maybe it could mess with their attacks as well. However, somewhere deep inside, Nazag knew that this wasn't the case. He raised his bow into the skies, his heartbeat slowing. After the first volley failed, leaving him and his people stunned, The oryx were still quickly closing the gap. In just a few more moments, they would be upon them. Nazag realized that maybe the only way to salvage this situation was to kill Lionel. He's about 100 meters up and 3 kilometers away. This is a routine shot. Nazag took a breath. Reaching into his quiver, he pulled out a radiant white arrow and pulled. His bow trembled once and ancient runes began to light up across its body. A white bow force erupted from him, spiraling around his arrow and shifting his hair like the wind. Dang! Nazag released with an exhale. It whistled through the sky with a harsh sound, gathering momentum as it moved until it seemed to become 2 arrows spiraling around one another. This was Nazag's most powerful single-shot technique, at least the most powerful one he frequently used. It could be considered an excellent probing shot. His eyes narrowed as his arrow seemed to appear before Lionel in the blink of an eye. The entire world seemed to be focused on this exchange. However, Lionel's expression was indifferent and unmoved. As he stood on the back of his dragon construct, his pale violet hair shifted in the wind. The arrow appeared before his eyebrows, but just when it seemed like his head would be penetrated, exploding for all to see, the arrow suddenly crumbled. The bow force vanished, and the arrow that was left fluttered away in a rain of ash. Nazag froze, his hand trembling. Lionel looked down toward him without a word. The deep abyss of those pale violet eyes were suffocating. Despite the distance that separated them, it felt like they were face to face. As Nazag craned his neck and Lionel calmly met his gaze, the difference between them seemed all too obvious. Roar! The Oryx army crashed into the Constellation Bow Alliance's formation. Realizing that their bow force had suddenly become useless, they could only use their bows as sticks, relying on their fists and legs to counter. But what good was it? Outside of Nazag and his small group that held up well, countering and killing a few Oryx, against the mighty and strong bodies of the Oryx who had recently undergone hyper-evolution, they stood little chance at all. Nazag's gaze turned red as his people were slaughtered. Lionel didn't seem to care to raise even a single finger. He simply looked down with the loftiness of a king. For those on the outside who had watched Lionel meticulously measure every second, ensuring that not a moment was wasted, this was a sharp contrast to his usual tactics. However, it was exactly this sharp contrast that made it all the more glaring. He was doing it on purpose. He wanted this moment to be burned into their memories. It was a message that when he spoke arrogantly, it wasn't because he did as he willed and didn't comprehend the vastness of the world. It was because he had already prepared. It was because he was already 10 steps ahead. It was because he was already confident that others could never catch up to his steps. Lionel! Nazag roared. I'll never forgive your Morales family for doing this. Lionel looked down indifferently. As smart as he was, he could tell why Nazag was saying this. He could not wrap his head around how any of this could be happening if Lionel wasn't cheating. Cheating was the only viable answer he had. Lionel did not have to acknowledge his words at all. However, at that moment, he suddenly raised a hand. The Oryx, who had flooded forward like an endless tide, came to a halt, retreating just as smoothly. They were a well-oiled machine, responding to Lionel's commands without the slightest hitch. Lionel took a step forward, fluttering down from the back of his dragon construct as his bow appeared in his hand. When he landed, the two armies had already separated, leaving a no-man's land. His location was as dangerous as it could be, and yet he was unmoved by it all. He took the white lion bow off of his back, piercing it into the ground. With a wave of his hand, the bow of a fallen Constellation Bow Alliance member shot up from the ground and snapped into his palm with a satisfying clap. Without a word, he pulled back on the bow string, a radiant golden bow force forming. The instant Nazag saw this, his expression went from one of derision to shock and then helplessness, before it suddenly became fierce. He gripped his bow and lifted it up, roaring as he pulled back the string and released. Twang! Lionel shot an arrow at the same time, meeting Nazag's and dispelling it. Nazag shot again, but Lionel's arrow crossed the halfway mark even faster this time, colliding with its tip perfectly and shattering it. Nazag shot again and again, but every time, Lionel's arrow would meet it. It didn't seem to matter how it twisted, how it curved, or which direction it came from. The aerial assault between the two formed a net of white and gold in the skies, illuminating the dark skies. But as time passed, the golden arc quickly suppressed the white arcs. Lionel didn't move an inch, and his firing speed didn't seem to increase, and yet Nazag was quickly being suppressed and suffocated. Soon, his arrow could barely travel a few meters before they're destroyed. Then they could not even travel a meter. Then not even half a meter. Nazag pulled back his bow to fire again, but a golden arrow whizzed forward, shredding his bow apart and snapping it into two. The arrow shot into his shoulder, leaving a hole so large that half of his mangled, beating heart could still be seen. Lionel did not even look at Nazag, tossing the random bow he had picked up to the side, and picking up the white lion bow. At that moment, the white lions of the bow unleashed a mighty roar that shocked the skies. It swallowed up Lionel's bow force, emitting a mightier and mightier aura until it finally unshackled the last of its chains. The aura of the gold grade crumbled, and the aura of the true life grade weapon burst forth. Lionel calmly strapped the bow to his back as Nazag looked forward, blood spilling from his mouth. "I'm not sure why you all thought you were worthy of this bow," Lionel uttered lightly. "Kill the rest of them, they're not worth anything." Roar. The oryx charged, their gazes crimson with endless fervor. Chapter 1948. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 1948. Nightside. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The lips of the Constellation Bow Alliance elders trembled as they watched the light fade from Nazag's eyes. It was a complete slaughter. He never stood a chance. The worst humiliation was that Lionel hadn't even used the white lion bow. All the while, it was stuck in the ground by his side, and he suffocated Nazag with nothing more than sheer skill. If he had wanted, Nazag wouldn't have been able to gather up any bow force at all. This was the fundamental difference between a fake sovereign and a true sovereign. Back then, Lionel could only rely on someone actually attacking him with a spear to crush their spear force. However, now, not only were spears, bows and arrows useless against him, he could even extend this ability into a domain that crushed all opposition. Nazag might have believed that Lionel was cheating, but the rest of them had all seen the process from start to end with their own eyes. If Lionel had been cheating, or if the Morales had made his path forward easier, they would have been able to sense it. There was no escaping it. Lionel had crushed them. Then when their best genius complained, he gave him a chance and then crushed him again. From the very beginning, the fact the Constellation Bow Alliance used the bow had sealed their fates. This was never their stage, and it was their misfortune to be placed near Lionel. Death was always the only path forward. Ancestor Mito trembled. His grip on the flagship tightened to the point the metal within his palms turned molten. He had a belly full of fury, but he didn't know where to aim it. He never expected that the Constellation Bow Alliance would be the first major power to be eliminated like this. Even the Gold Dark organization still had others inside, though they had already lost their strongest pair. This humiliation would follow them for a lifetime. Lionel returned to the skies, landing by Aina's side as the massacre below was swiftly completed. Aina's gaze was placid, however she still asked a question. Will it really be alright? She was obviously referring to Lionel's ruthless methods. He truly seemed intent on killing every genius he came across, even the heirs. In the past air wars, heirs always survived, firstly because of the Morales family rules, and second because there were mechanisms in place for them to give up ahead of time and be transported out. This was a measure provided this time as well. The difference was that Lionel didn't give them a chance. He killed the Gold Dark brothers before they even realized the kind of threat they were facing, and he spit in the face of Nazag's pride, placing him in a position where his only thoughts were of clawing back his dignity. However, those that came to support the heirs were fair game. This was supposed to be a measurement of the charisma of the heir, who would be able to gather up subordinates who knew that their lives would be in danger, while their leader would never have to face death himself. But now it had become the burial ground so many geniuses had fallen to. I want them to be enraged. I want them to retaliate. I want them to be so infuriated that they lose all logic and reason. That way, once we step foot out of here, I can unify the human domain in a single bound. Aina's gaze flashed. She had wondered why Lionel had been so serious from the very beginning. It turned out his goal was never these air wars to begin with. Lionel was a person who took his preparation seriously, yes. He had always taken his two mantras, respect and persistence, to the absolute extreme. However, it was also because of this preparation that he tended to be lackadaisical and casual in his execution. This time it was different though. From the moment he opened his eyes this morning, there was an unconcealed sharpness around him. Even James didn't dare to joke around at this point, and everyone had their best brought out of them. Lionel's demeanor had become like a guiding light in the dead of night. Everyone was in lockstep. They could subtly feel the kind of momentum that was brewing. This wasn't just the air wars. This was the start of the domain war. On the other side of the air war moon, most of the participants were oblivious to the looming threat. The sun was still high in the skies on this side as it had started off in the dead of the night. The disadvantage was that claiming villages in the dark was far more difficult as many had buffs during this time to their alertness. At the same time, there were far more creatures and barbarians spawned in the wild. However, it could be argued that these two changes actually made those who were spawned on the night half of the moon far luckier. Only Lionel had been focused on claiming a territory as quickly as possible. Most were more concerned with gathering points, clearing challenges, and completing kill exchanges. With the added number of spawned creatures that could be slaughtered, the size of groups on the night side had surpassed that of the day side. Of the 7 heirs, 4 were located on the night side, while 3 were located on Lionel's half of the moon. Audiobook had already gathered over 100 subordinates. Although this number paled in comparison to the near 1,000 that the Constellation Bow Alliance had, it had to be remembered that the Alliance had only gathered this amount because they had multiple heirs participating, while Audiobook was on his own. What was curious, though, was the fact the heir performing the best on the night side wasn't Audiobook the first Nova, but rather the third Nova, Zavnik, who had suddenly exploded with a great potential. Almost the moment they entered, several heirs seemed to have betrayed their families, rushing toward Zavnik's location. By the end of the first day, they had already built a coalition of over 2,000. Chapter 1949. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 and 3 seconds p.m. Chapter 1949. Loopholes. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Zavnik's actions should have gotten far more praise than they did. He almost rightfully thought himself to be leading the pack. He had taken advantage of an obvious loophole in the rules, but taking advantage of this loophole wasn't simple. Those that participated needed to come from prominent families, and he also had to convince not just the participants themselves to follow him, but even the powerful elders behind them that following his steps was in their best interest. With the fact that the Morales family were quickly becoming the public enemy of the human domain, especially as Lionel continued his slaughter, how could such a thing be simple? In fact, it was so difficult that it bordered on impossible. Pulling this off, especially given the short time that was given, was a feat of feats. Not only had this allowed Zavnik to accumulate a large number of subordinates in the shortest period of time, but he had also claimed 3 territories already. Although they were all still at the subgrade, this was done on purpose by him. He didn't want to grab too much attention too soon. His goal was to covertly gather up enough points and resources to push all 3 territories to the silver grade by the end of the second day. By then, he would be leagues beyond anyone else. In fact, the only ones aware that he had gathered such an army beneath him already were those who were watching from the outside. From the perspective of those on the night side, everything was normal. On the day side, the 2 other heirs outside of Lionel were 5th Nova, Ramon, and 2nd Nova, Oren. Interestingly enough, Ramon had taken a very similar approach to Lionel, just much slower. When he found a village, he and his partner, Valerie, got to work. After clearing the village, work that Valerie seemed to take charge of practically alone, Ramon entered the center console of the village and brought out a workbench and a force-crafting quill. He had made the same decision as Lionel. Trading for individual treasures was too expensive. He would craft his way out. While he worked, Valerie used the territory map to find challenges and clear them quickly, even entering a dungeon on her own. This valiant woman seemed to have a spear that was unstoppable, Nothing could seem to last even a single strike, and she swept through everything she came across. By the end of the first day, they had nearly 100 subordinates as well, and each and every one was outfitted with gold-grade armors and weapons. Then, in the dead of night, they directly challenged the bronze-grade upgrade. As for Oren, his approach seemed to be the oddest of them all. He completely ignored the villages despite the fact that he had come across 2 unclaimed ones on the first day. He and his partner seemed to vanish into the shadows, making their position hard to lock on even for those watching. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact you could find whichever candidate you wanted to check on with just a thought, even they might have already lost track of him. However, it was also due to this that Oren was easy to forget, especially with all of the other fireworks. As such, many only checked on him every few hours, not having the patience to give him their full attention. And it was because of this that no one seemed to have a grasp of what he was doing. The heirs weren't the only ones of the day side. Half of the constellation families were also present. Of them, the Leo family and the Gamine families were performing the best. The Leo family were entirely focused on the brute force method. They had placed their 2 best geniuses, Conan and Gunter, on the same team. Both had only recently entered the 7th dimension, but their strength made many veterans shrink, their power output splitting and trembling the earth. They had by far the smallest group at not even a dozen, but this wasn't due to their lack of kills. Outside of Lionel, Adderworth and the cumulative efforts of Zavnik's coalition, they likely had the most. However, they had converted all of these kills directly to points, first outfitting themselves with their best weapons and armors long since prepared, and then, strangely, pairing themselves with beast companions. Beast companions fell under a unique category. They could be exchanged for using both kill exchanges or like treasures. It depended on the individual's choice. But what was interesting was the Leo family first traded in all of their kills for points, then traded for their beasts. This move was clever because the cost of their beasts was less than that of what they received for the kills. However, the question was, why would the Leo family be trading for such weak beasts to begin with? Obviously, the more talented the beast, the more it cost. For their beasts to cost so little, they couldn't be very talented at all. But when the elders on the outside saw these beasts, their eyes widened. These beasts were indeed not talented, they could even be said to be inferior. The amount of effort it would have taken to raise them to the 7th dimension simply wasn't worth the return. And yet, each and every one of them was the middle 7th dimensional tier, tier 4 at worst, tier 6 at best. Even the strongest participating heir was only at tier 2. The 100-year limit on age was devastating, and each step taken in the 7th dimension could be counted as its own watershed, let alone if you were crossing tier 3 to tier 4, or tier 6 to tier 7. These gaps were enormous. But now the Leo family had taken advantage of their own loophole in the rules to bring out such powerhouses for cheap. It was clear and obvious that they had invested a great deal. For the cost it would have taken to raise beasts of such poor talent, they could have raised dozens of geniuses with just decent talent to that level, hundreds maybe. The approach of the Gamine family, though, was just as clever and resourceful. Chapter 1950. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 1950. Fusion. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The Leo family's methods were already excellent. While the age limit of humans was 100 years, the age limit of beasts was the exact same. If they weren't, then wouldn't that mean that these families could just send any 8th dimensional beasts they had in? They had obviously planned for this long ago. Just looking at the beasts, it was clear that they wouldn't be able to live much longer than another 2 or 3 years, a price paid for such fast improvement, which was also likely why they hadn't used such methods on humans. As for the Gamine family, they paired themselves quite oddly. Usually, the Gamine family geniuses would be born in pairs. When their women released eggs, their special bloodlines, once said egg was fertilized, would cause them to split into a yin and a yang. This would produce twins that were almost identical in every aspect, but not quite identical. These twins would be the perfect battle partners and could communicate across exaggerated distances. This was why it was so weird, initially, that rather than pairing these yin and yang twins together, The Gamine family had sent in 2 pairs of geniuses, pairing 2 yangs and 2 yins. One pair of these twins were ones that Lionel had intimate familiarity with, as they had entered the same selection village as him back then. Juan and Droit, Juan being the white-haired and dark-skinned yin twin, and Droit being the black-haired and white-skinned yang twin. However, in this case they were separated, matching with Hewlett, a yin twin, and Druid, a yang twin. Hewlett and Druid were a pair of sisters, while Juan and Droit were a pair of brothers. The two could be considered cousins, with Hewlett and Druid being in a middle generation between the Cataclysm generation and Velasco's generation. When the 2 pairs entered, they split once again. But rather than meeting up with their partners, they picked a point and fanned out. Using their communication abilities, they built territory maps between the 2 of them larger than any city, far larger than even Lionel's one. In just a day, they had mapped out the entire Dayside, finding all currently occurring challenges and taking down all those nearby them. If there was a number 1 group in terms of challenges cleared, it was no doubt the Gamine family. The number of points they had accumulated had already long entered the hundreds of thousands, and their understanding of the situation was excellent. As for how they had done this, they used their internal sight like radars. Because they could connect while disregarding the distance, their internal sight connected like a singular line across hundreds and even thousands of kilometers. Then, by pouring their soul force to reinforce the strand of connection, they could send subtle waves into the surroundings, mapping it out like radio waves. Although the maps weren't in striking detail, they didn't need to be. This alone was enough for them to know the location of every challenge, every dungeon, and every village on an entire half of the moon. After this, they picked the most prime location on the Dayside, a village with the best natural resources and defenses. In addition, this was a village that started at the bronze grade from the very beginning. After claiming it, they used the kill exchanges they had gathered to gather up dozens of subordinates. Then, giving them the location of the dungeons they had already mapped out, they sent them out, only leaving a small number to protect their territory. The most shocking part about their strategy was that as they brought forward more and more of their family methods, their ability to scan the region got faster and faster, even having teams dedicated to updating them with the new spawns. Although their start was relatively slow, their efforts seemed to be quickly snowballing, and it was only increasing in speed. It was safe to say that there were others performing quite excellently, although Lionel was still in first place. If he couldn't continue pushing forward at this pace, he would be quickly surpassed before he could take advantage of the lead he currently had. But knowing Lionel, how could he allow such a thing to happen? Even as the Oryx completed the rest of the slaughter, Lionel entered the center of the subgrade village with Aina, his thoughts dancing. 500 million points was incredibly steep, and the prices beyond that would only become steeper and more exaggerated to the point that they might take years to accumulate. There was no simple method to accumulate so many points. Grinding was the only option. However, there was another path to advancement, and that was fusing cities. By combining 3 city cores of the same grade, you could trigger an upgrade challenge. The drawback was that the upgrade challenge would be more difficult as a result. The enemies would be marginally stronger, and much more numerous. It would be akin to triggering 3 upgrade challenges simultaneously. Lionel had already decided that this would be his right, but the when was difficult. He simply didn't have enough subordinates, especially compared to these families who had billions of descendants per generation. As a result, he needed to not only end these air wars before they had enough time to accumulate too many kill exchanges for him to handle. He could also only have just a single large territory, because he couldn't adequately defend more than that while also maintaining pressure on his enemies. Still, the question remained, would he fuse 3 silver-grade cities? Or would he fuse 3 gold-grade cities together? Lionel shook his head. There was only one choice. With a wave of his hand, he spent all the points they had just accumulated and triggered the bronze-grade and silver-grade challenges back to back. With an army of 10,000 ready and prepared, they steamrolled through the both. After this, there was only one path left, and that was to find another silver-grade city core to fuse into his own. As Lionel was making his choice, the Gamine were communicating. Since they had mapped out the entire Dayside, they had long since found Lionel's territory, but they hadn't taken action just yet. Their original plan after seeing how close the Constellation Bow Alliance and Lionel were was to allow the two of them to fight it out and let them reap the rewards as they focused on other things. But very soon, they would receive news of their destruction as the scouts assigned to that region swept through once more. Chapter 1951. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 1951. 20% if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The Constellation Bow Alliance has been destroyed. Although it's not confirmed, Nazag has likely died along with them. It doesn't seem like any but a few who used their escape badges managed to keep their lives. A scout reported to the 4 Libra heirs, a solemn expression on their face. Author's note: mistake on my part. The 4 heirs that were introduced in yesterday's chapters are part of the Libra family, not the Gamine family. Apparently I can't keep my own story straight. Cries in corner. The Gamine and Libra family have a very close relationship with one another, something mentioned back in Vol 7. Apparently, that relationship is close enough that I mixed them up. It was obvious that after learning of the claiming of 2 territories, they would pay a great amount of attention to them. The commotion caused by Lionel wasn't small in the slightest, and it was too difficult to hide an army of 10,000. In addition, there's been a change to Lionel Morales' territory as well. A mountain seems to have appeared out of nowhere, and it's gone from a territory that's difficult to defend to one that has an incredible terrain advantage. We aren't sure of how this happened. The 4 heirs frowned, looking toward one another. They had only just returned, prepared to press their advantage. They wouldn't be together considering the advantage they had when separated if it wasn't for something extremely important, and that important thing was obviously upgrading their territory. However, what they didn't expect was that the moment they returned, they would receive what could only be said to be bad news. They weren't exactly close to Lionel's territory. In fact, they were quite far. The land Lionel had chosen was quite barren, and could only be salvaged with the help of several terrain-changing rewards. However, their territory was lush and vibrant. There was a huge climate change between there and here. Even so, because of the way the air wars seemed to be shaping up, there would likely be a victor decided between the 2 hemispheres before an overall was chosen between the 2 behemoths that remained on their feet. This was almost guaranteed because the moon was currently separated into 2 supercontinents, one on the night side and the other on the day side. It wasn't worthwhile to invest in seafaring vessels and the like to cross to the other side if it wasn't absolutely necessary. It would only slow their progress. All for what? To end up in a land they had no information about? It wasn't worth it. Mountain? It should be a dungeon reward. There was a dungeon located between Lionel Morales' territory and the Constellation Bow Alliance's. It was closer to the Constellation Bow Alliance's territory, so it's surprising that Lionel Morales got his hands on it first, Hewlett said slowly. Juan and Droit were silent. They were the 2 with the most understanding of Lionel. They could still remember the first time they met him. He had started off with quite a disadvantage in the true selection as well, but what had happened in the end? Since then, they had been quite wary of him. For him to end up with the dungeon first. Is it a coincidence? From our most recent scan, he seemed to have been alone with his partner for a very long time. That's very much unlike the Constellation Bow Alliance, which spread out with numerous groups, covering a large area, Druid supplemented. According to the new map, he now has several new outposts in the region, but their placement is odd. They're placed very far from the boundaries of a bronze-grade village, the scout said. The gazes of the 4 Libra heirs sharpened all at once, causing the scout to go quite pale. How far? It should be 420 kilometers from his village? The 4 Libra heirs all stood. As Lionel has said previously, the details of the upgrades available at the silver grade were kept in the dark. As such, there wasn't enough information to conclude that Lionel had a silver grade village which he had expanded the territory of twice over to 400 kilometers. Given that his upgraded outposts each had a radial range of 20 kilometers, that would explain the extra 20. However, even though they couldn't deduce this, they all knew that Lionel wasn't a fool despite how disdainful they had been of his threats. There seemed to be only 2 explanations for this. The first was that Lionel had received a rare reward that allowed him to extend the territory range of his village. As such, he placed his outposts a large distance away relying on this. The second explanation was that Lionel was using outposts in place of his scouts, using them to alert him of movement much earlier on. However, this second method felt quite foolish. The price-to-reward ratio wasn't worth it. The number of outposts that would be necessary was excessive. It would cost millions at the very least. How many outposts are there? There aren't many, less than a dozen. The four heirs frowned in confusion. Even just to cover a circumference of 420 kilometers, you would need at least 260 bronze-grade outposts with 10-kilometer ranges. Even if you doubled that, the price was eye-watering. What was the point of so few outposts? Show us the locations of these outposts. The scout hurriedly brought forward a crude map that seemed to update in real time. It was less accurate to say that the map was crude, and it was instead just not very detailed. Even so, there were many important points on it. Juan's pupils were the first to constrict this configuration. They're all strategic points, Druid said with narrowed eyes. Heres the closest water source. Heres a choke point. Every time Druid pointed, it would elucidate another important point. When she finished, they all looked up. It was impossible for someone who hadn't had any scouts to have such a good understanding of the overall situation. The only explanation left was that Lionel's territory had a range of at least 400 kilometers. Not only that, but after he had claimed Nazag's territory, he had somehow gotten it to 400 kilometers of range first as well. If this was true, Lionel didn't have a vague outline of the dayside. He had a near-perfect map of what amounted to at least 20% of the dayside. A map that was far more valuable than their vague outlines of 100% of it. Chapter 1952. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:07 p.m. Chapter 1952. Trump card versus trump card. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The gap isn't that big. What's most important is terrain, dungeons and challenges. We have a strong grasp of all of those. We have a strong grasp of terrain and challenges, as well as villages, but dungeons are more difficult. They're often hidden and don't have any obvious markers. We can only make educated guesses. In terms of range, we have the upper hand. But in terms of details and dungeons specifically, we're definitely on the losing end. The situation wasn't as bad as they thought. Although they didn't know how Lionel had gotten so much range, there was still a large buffer between them and him. In addition, they had their own preparations. But look here, Nazag's territory is gone. That means he's moved it. But why? He's planning on using the fusion method. He used the territory map of Nazag's village first, memorized it, then took it with him. Remember, Lionel Morales is the youngest of us all. He lost 20 years, and he is also the littlest Nova. He's been behind from the very beginning. He knows this more than anyone. So his goal is to focus on just a single territory. This is good for us. We'll always know where he is. It'll be much easier to monitor him. I suggest we assign a team to him. With the shorter range, the maps will be much more detailed, and we'll be able to pay attention to everything he does and respond accordingly. Agreed, but we need some other measures as well. Fifth Nova is expanding quickly, and he's our most immediate enemy. We can't divert too much attention to a fire so far away and end up burned on this side. That much is easy. We failed to use the Constellation Bow Alliance, however I think we'll have to stop holding back. Our advantages aren't as large as we would like, especially with these variables. Let's release a few more trump cards. Already? The best faction to use given the situation is the Leo family, but a Constellation family isn't so easy to make use of even if their leader is a bit dense. This is the best choice. The four looked toward one another and nodded. This was a trump card they only wanted to use during the end game. Using it now would expose their tracks ahead of time and make it less effective in the future. But sometimes part of a powerful trump card was knowing when to use it, and waiting until the last moment wasn't always the ideal moment. As the Libra were scheming, Lionel had already been taking his own steps. They were very much correct about the fact that he had taken advantage of succeeding in the upgrade challenge, to map out another 400 kilometers. The price was steep, but he valued information overall. What he needed most was the location of his next target, and he had found it. But first, he used the almost 1,000 kill exchanges he had gained from the Constellation Bow Alliance, and that over 10,000 he had gained from another successful Silvergrade challenge, to call forward more subordinates. The first group Lionel called forward was the Umbra family. In fact, he had called them forward even before beginning the challenge, because he had been waiting precisely for nightfall. Lionel nodded toward Radlys and nodded. You have the night. By the end of it, I want to know everything about this supercontinent. Ignore all challenges, mark down the location any dungeons, and want a systematic report of every air and territory in this region. Yes. Radlys nodded. In a flash, he and hundreds of Umbra family members melded into the night. It was as though they had never been there at all, fusing into the shadows like phantoms. In the depths of the night, they were truly at home. Back when the Umbra family attacked Earth, they were able to vanish from sight even in the middle of the day. However, Lionel had still waited for night to set them loose. There were multiple reasons for this, but the main reason was efficiency. The strength of the Umbra family was several times more powerful in the night, and they could, as such, finish their tasks much faster. It wasn't worth it to trade for them earlier than now, as they weren't able to display their true strength for fear of exposing their family's ties to the Three-Finger Cult. As such, much like he had done with everything else, Lionel only revealed his cards at the absolute perfect time. After this, Lionel waved a hand and dozens appeared before him. To the absolute astonishment of those watching from the outside, every single one of them was a member of the Cloud race. However, they were all in chains. Lionel had long since bound their wills to him, with a thought he could kill them. So long as they refused to follow his orders, their death was inevitable. Of course, Lionel had done all of this long ago. He wouldn't waste precious time here torturing and convincing. Lionel waved a hand and removed their chains. He flipped a palm, revealing a communication device. His gaze flickered through it as he read with great speed. This information was none other than what Emna and James had already sent back to him after their half-day's effort. Within it, there were a few territories already marked. Of course, Lionel couldn't rely on the information given by just two people, especially since their original job was only to clear as many challenges and dungeons as possible. Information was secondary. This was why he had sent out the Umbra family as well. That said, this advanced information, as crude as it was good enough to send out a few teams of Cloud race members. You few will go here. As for you here, Lionel quickly assigned them. Without many words, the Cloud race dispersed. After activating their race's movement technique, they were like wisps of silvery gray in the night, fast and imperceptible. Chapter 1953, published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1953. Most neglected. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's asks of them weren't as detailed as he would like, but the rest would have to wait until the Umbra family returned. For now this would have to do. They would know to infiltrate to the highest level of management they could. Although it didn't feel like it, there were, quite literally, hundreds of heirs participating. With the sheer number of families there were, and how many had completely disregarded his words, this number was actually on the lower end. However, the moon was small, only about half to 3/4 the size of Earth. Of course, a few thousand people versus a moon of this size still made looking for people like looking for a needle in a haystack. As such, Lionel knew he didn't just need to care for the bigwigs, he also needed to find and crush the smaller players before they could get a foothold. The reason for this was obvious. As he improved his lead, he would eventually become a threat, and because of his abrasive words, he would become a target. Not that he wasn't already a target to begin with. Even if Lionel was nothing more than a smiling face and spread nothing but niceties, they would still want to deal with him. In that case, Lionel had an obvious ticking time bomb strapped to his ankle, and that was the obvious ending where he was swarmed from all sides. He had a numbers problem to face to begin with. If he had to face so many at once, it would be hard to come out victorious. In that case, Lionel needed to start placing certain countermeasures in place now. The outposts were only the beginning. He would begin systematically grinding away at all of these enemies one by one. The Umbra would deal with any small groups they ran into that could be casually dealt with. They were a family of assassins after all. This first group of Cloud Race would infiltrate the few that could be considered to be at a middle range, and destroy them from the inside out. Once the Umbra returned with a full detailed report, he would send out another group of Cloud Race with the purpose of targeting the largest groups and waiting for the opportune moment to crush them. Lionel finished assigning the Cloud Race swiftly. He turned toward the Oryx. Return to the village, enter the segmented cubes pods and rest. There are 1,000 total pods. Take turns. After each group finishes, head to the north, east, west, south and there in between cardinal directions respectively. The remaining 2,000 of you will say to guard the village. With the segmented cube, Lionel had a measure to deal with the fatigue pushed onto them by the environment. 15 minutes in the pod was worth a day of rest, but by the time they came out, they would be in pristine condition. Although he only had 1,000 of them, or more accurately could only spare the energy to use 1,000 at a time, it would only take 2 hours and a half for all 10,000 of the Oryx to be rejuvenated to their full strength. As for the first 8 groups, I will leave it to your commanders to decide when to retreat and when to advance. Do not die needless deaths. Leave it to me, Elther said boldly. Lionel nodded and sent them away. Then he used the remaining more than 10,000 kill exchanges he had gained from the second silver grade upgrade challenge, and summoned a large army of Sky's family members. If the number of Lionel's subordinates were to be counted, the largest number without a doubt came from the Sky's family. But as a family that wasn't necessarily the strongest, they obviously didn't have too many 7th dimensional experts younger than 100 years old. Even so, for a family of that scale, while producing 10,000 such individuals who had entered with the God path was impossible, they had more than enough of such individuals who had done so with the conventional path. And that was all Lionel needed. This was yet another loophole to take advantage of. While it was true that fatigue worked more luck it would for third-dimensional existences in this world, that was only after they stepped foot into this world. This meant that from the moment they were summoned, a subordinate would have a fresh pair of legs and eyes. A fresh pair of legs and eyes perfect for war. Lionel soared into the skies. Although he could feel the fatigue settling in already, his gaze was still cold and sharp. Before daybreak, he would claim his 3rd silver grade territory. Tomorrow, the Air Wars would introduce its first gold grade territory. As Lionel marched, a group of individuals quickly caught up. With the village soon to be protected by the Oryx, Lionel's brothers had already caught up. Lionel wasn't taking any chances on this. He would kill 2 birds with 1 stone on this expedition. Not only would he claim his 3rd territory, he would take down his 2nd constellation family. The Tor family and Armand had entered his line of sight. He would conveniently deal with a small grudge at the same time. In an unknown corner of the Air Wars moon, a familiar trio had gathered. They stood by the ocean that separated the 2 supercontinents, cold air blowing by. They seemed close to one of the poles, but the water didn't seem intent on freezing over. Despite the fact it was clearly salted, it moved like a rushing river. These 3 were none other than Aurinik, Richard and Montero. This will be the most neglected region of the Air Wars, but I believe the ancestor of Morales will be quite thorough. If we claim the seas before anyone else, anyone who wants victory will have to come through us, Aurinik said lightly. That sounds nice, Montero said somewhat skeptically, but the question is how? We won't be the only ones. The Pisk and Quarius families will definitely have the same idea. Also, one of them is tied to the first Nova as well. Hearing this, Aurinik's smile only widened. Chapter 1954. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 58 seconds p.m. Chapter 1954. Never stop if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1954. Never stop. Stop being mysterious. This is serious. Montero pressed. However, to Montero's surprise, rather than explaining, Aurinik looked toward Richard. Richard stepped to the edge of the rushing tide, his expression unreadable as he looked forward. It was difficult to tell what he was thinking, but he suddenly began to speak a moment later. Many people think that the Viola family's lineage factor is just related to heaviness. Our violet force is indeed quite heavy to everyone but us. It allows us to use less effort to explode with a great amount of strength. The more of our violet force we use, the greater the difference between our effort output and the strength resulting from it. However, this isn't the true secret of the Viola family. Do you know how old it'll be this year? Montero frowned. They had all been checked before entering. They should all be less than 100 years old. Beneath 100 years old, one's age didn't really matter very much unless you were still stuck at a low-dimensional tier. But Richard obviously didn't have this problem. Richard shook his head. I'm already almost 1,000 years old. It took me a lot of effort to reach this point. I was still in tier 9 of the 5th dimension when I was into my 70s. How could make it to the 7th dimension before I turned 100 years old? In fact, with my talent, it probably should have been impossible to ever take that step. Montero's frown deepened. What was Richard trying to get at? And why was he saying all of this? The true ability of violet force isn't heaviness. The description is much simpler, but far more profound. It can be summarized in just a single line: increasing output. Whatever you give, you will always receive more, and the true ability of violet force isn't heaviness. The description is much simpler, but far more profound. It can be summarized in just a single line: increasing output. Whatever you give, you will always receive more in return for. If I want to run at 10 miles an hour, my violet force will allow me to run at 12 with no added effort. If I swing to 100 pounds of force, my violet force will produce a swing of 150 pounds with no added effort on my part. If I exchange dozens of years of life, it'll receive the equivalent of hundreds of years of training results. Montero's heart skipped a beat. If what Richard was saying was true, how could anyone ever defeat the Viola family? Just what kind of force was this violet force, and why was it that he had never heard anything about it before? And with such a force backing them, why was the Viola family so weak? No, even more importantly than that, why was Richard so weak? Richard wasn't even comparable to the geniuses of the Cataclysm generation who had stepped into the 7th dimension. But the way he spoke about his lineage factor, it would be hard to say that any lineage factor in all of existence could be said to be better. He was quite vague with his numbers, and there didn't seem to be any consistency between them. But even if he only gained the smaller 20% boost he mentioned first, that was game-changing. A 20% change in strength, especially in the 7th dimension, was huge. Nothing seemed to make sense about this. I understand all your questions already. Why are we so weak? Why am I so weak? Why was my family destroyed not just once, but twice? It's quite pathetic when you think about it. Richard looked toward Montero. If I gave you access to a powerful force right now, how well would you be able to use it? Take what you have the highest affinity in right now and imagine I gave you the number 1 force in that category. What would you be able to do with it? Montero's creased brows slowly loosened. Indeed, he wouldn't be able to do much with it at all. Just because you had high fire affinity, didn't mean Scarlet Star Force would listen to you. In fact, it might try to kill you instead. Lionel had the highest Scarlet Star Force affinity a person could possibly have, and it was still trying to kill him. Richard looked away. Sometimes I think that some god was playing games with our family, rather than a blessing. This lineage factor has been more like a curse. Every step is labor-intensive. Whenever I have a small breakthrough and sense an increase in my life, I have no choice but to gamble it away in hopes that I can take another. That's how I've made it here to this point. If not for becoming trapped in that zone for those years, I would have never made the breakthroughs I had to finally reach this point and gain what small understanding of this force that I have. Even Lionel could have never guessed that this was the reason Richard looked far older than he should have. Richard had only lived less than 100 years, but the amount of years he had exchanged just to reach this point made him far older than that. He counted his age not in how much time passed, but in how many years he had lost. His every day was consumed by thoughts of revenge, of avenging his fallen family, of finally reaching the point where he could raise their legacy to the place his ancestors, and all those who had died had hoped and wished for every day. The price was heavy, but he didn't plan to stop. He would never stop. These air wars were the perfect opportunity. If they could win, not only would they be able to get revenge on Lionel, but they would also be able to partake in the rewards the various families and organizations had pooled together. If they could take first place, then the losses his family had suffered would be returned 100-fold. And when the time came, the Viola family would rise to the height it was always meant to be at. He had started from zero before, he would just have to do it again. Chapter 1955. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06:40 p.m. Chapter 1955. Demand if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again 1955 demand. Then what is your plan? Montero calmed his heart. He realized that things were spinning out of his control, and he didn't like it very much. But what allowed him to maintain his composure was the fact that although Richard had such hidden means, and Orinik was somehow privy to it all, was the fact that neither one of them felt outside of his ability to control. Of course, the three of them were allies, but such alliances only worked when all three had something equal to contribute. If that balance ever changed, it would quickly slip into a master-servant relationship. He couldn't allow his Aemon family to fall into such a situation after they had finally shed the label of sixth-dimensional family. At the same time, Montero needed to make sure that his inner thoughts didn't leak out. There was no need to strain the current relationship needlessly. One of the discoveries I've made is the fact that my violet force isn't just useful on myself, and only myself. If I extend it to others, I can trigger sacrifices within them to force changes. Of course, such parties have to be willing or far weaker than me. But this has some interesting applications, especially when you learn to hone on the exchange point. Using my body as a medium, I can force exchanges even between one or more creatures. When I learned this, my progress became faster as I didn't have to experiment on myself any longer. I could master control of my force in lesser creatures and only use tried and tested methods on myself. Richard bent forward and placed a palm of the dark waters. In the depths of the night, it looked quite black, its depths remaining completely unknown. In the Rain Galaxy, there's a very special race of beasts known as the Rain Beasts. They're exceptionally weak, so much so that they're usually kept as domestic pets. From afar, they look like little puffs of blue clouds. They have no faces, no limbs, and are basically just spherical fur balls. They're usually quite hard to find. They like to rest at the bottom of freshwater sources where they can get quite large. Their existence didn't become well known until they started clogging up some important waterways of populated planets. At first they were just directly killed, but this approach led to large floods. It turns out that the rain beasts are very good at absorbing water. It just takes them a long time. A very long time. However, when you kill them, they release it all at once, and water, though a seemingly benign creation, can be exceptionally dangerous at the right pressures. In the right quantities. A rain beast that only absorbs a small amount of water is a cute house pet that can be used to stay cool on a warm day, or water your plants conveniently. A rain beast that absorbs a large amount of water is a natural disaster. As they are now, rain beasts aren't very useful to use. But after I'm done with them. Richard retracted his hand, looking up and asking a question he already knew the answer to. How many points will it take to trade for one rain beast? They're not even considered bronze grade, Orinik said with a laugh. Trading for a prepared resources always costs 10 times less than gaining it here. Killing an air-grade threat would provide 100,000 points here, so it only costs 10,000 points to trade for a prepared air-grade treasure. A subgrade threat provides 10 points. A subgrade treasure exchange. Just 1 point. How many rain beasts do we have? Orinik's smile grew wider. More than we can use. Richard's, Orinik's, and Montero's gazes all burned frighteningly bright as they looked toward the ocean. Indeed, they could make these seas theirs. And the irony of it all? Richard wouldn't even have these beasts if not for Lionel forcing him to attack the Rain Galaxy back then in his scheme. Originally, Richard had gathered as many as he could, prepared to counter the chaotic water sector he believed had betrayed him, and now they would lead to Lionel's downfall. To Richard, he felt that this was all too poetic. The conversation of these three went completely unnoticed. With all the excitement going on, not a single soul cared to pay attention to three relative unknowns. The heirs of the human domain's strongest families were fighting it out. How could they have time to care about three families that had only recently entered the seventh dimension? It also didn't help that it felt like every one of Lionel's actions was taking the attention of the elders by storm. The choice to challenge the Silvergrade immediately once again, especially right after the Oryx had fought such a large battle, was baffling. Many couldn't help but comment on the fact that he was pushing his men too far. It would only be a matter of time before they collapsed. But before this thought could even be properly formed, the sleeping pods of the segmented cube left them in complete and utter silence. After 15 minutes, the Oryx exited as though they had rested for weeks, their auras as towering and powerful as when they first began their march. Many didn't get much time to spend being surprised about this, because the appearance of the Umbra family left those of Shield Cross Stars watching with narrowed gazes. Cross Elder Avon, who was also in attendance, couldn't help but watch with a frown. He had never seen such perfect assassin's techniques. Even with his eyes, he couldn't quite keep up with their movements. And after they scattered, because none of them were heirs, there was no easy method of finding them again. Just where had Lionel gotten such a force? But in very Lionel fashion, even this shock didn't have much time to settle down before Cross Elder Avon and many others stood to their feet, their eyes widened in shock. 1, 2, 12, 24, 100. Cross Elder Avon stopped counting, it no longer seemed to matter. He slapped his palm down, his rage echoing through the silence. Shield Cross Stars demands an explanation. Where did so many cloud race come from? Chapter 1956. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1956. Single 1. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1956. Single 1. From the beginning, Cross Elder Avon had been silent. He was supposed to be a neutral party, and though he had a belly full of both doubt and fury revolving around the matters of Earth, he had suppressed it. For the same reason he had to retreat from Earth's territory, maintaining the facade of neutrality Shield Cross Stars had. He also had to maintain proper decorum here. However, the moment he gained a chance to apply pressure, the suppressed fury and doubt erupted forth and he questioned the Morales loudly. By this point, Ancestor Alvaro's patience was wearing thin. It felt like an hour couldn't pass by without another jumping clown trying to apply pressure on his Morales family. When did they become an easy target seemingly anyone could step onto? Of course, Alvaro was exaggerating by no small amount. Whether it was Ancestor Golddark, Ancestor Mito of the Constellation Bow Alliance, or Cross Elder Avon, not only were they all eighth-dimensional monsters, each one of them was the leader of a powerhouse faction of great strength. While they weren't seen to be on the same level as the Morales family, they also couldn't be easily ignored, and this was especially so for Shield Cross Stars. Even so, Ancestor Alvaro didn't seem to give a damn. What kind of tone are you trying to use with me? He practically growled. Avon's temper was no less fiery. When he heard these words, he reacted like a tiger who had just gotten its tail stepped on. Fire quite literally blazed in his eyes, and the surrounding metal of his flagship began to turn red. Just earlier, when Lionel had arrived with their stolen flagship and descended to the air wars, he had already been stifling his words and actions. But now it seemed the Morales didn't care about poking the bear. Do you think the likes of you are capable of policing my tone? Do you think I won't sanction the whole Morales family for colluding with the Cloud Race? Last I checked, Cloud Race scum were gallivanting amidst your ranks. Didn't see any of them in chains until Littlest Nova exposed them. Does Shield Cross Stars have the right to sanction anyone? Cross Elder Avon had been ready for a spar of words, but his next volley was immediately cut off by these words. He felt stifled, so much so that his face turned beet red and his mustache bristled beneath his heaving breaths. However, unfortunately for him, the Morales weren't finished. Littlest Nova had to register all of these Cloud Race people before they were allowed to be used. Do you think we don't know where they came from? They were all in Earth's territory. Shield Cross Stars was present all the while, and yet it wasn't until you were kicked out that they were exposed. Police force of the human domain? What a joke. You can't even do your jobs as well as a junior. Avon's chest heaved. So you expect me to believe that just because you say so? Just like you wanted the human domain to believe that an heir of the Morales was a Tier 1 fugitive just because you said so? I still haven't sought an account about that matter. How dare you? You think I'm afraid of you? Come, come. Come seek your account. The bluster and billowing of the two old men made the starry skies quake. If not for the fact that most other families and organizations had sent their ancestors as well, the surrounding flagships would have already been blown to bits by this point. However, that was all. Bluster and billowing. Alvaro seemed to be daring Avon to do something more than just talk, but Avon seemed to be doing the same thing. Shield Cross stars still needed to maintain their neutrality, while Alvaro had already won their spar of words. By this point, Avon's responses were nothing more than the whining of a baby. The two barked back and forth, but quite quickly, their argument had no choice but to come to a pause as Lionel's army had already appeared in Armand Taurus territory. In that moment, the Tor Constellation family gripped their fists. Lionel was truly ruthless. In the dead of night he marched. By this point, the fatigue of the first batch of enterers was already setting in. For Lionel, it was no different. If there was any advantage he had, it was that his dream force was especially dense, so it took quite a lot to fatigue his mind, and his vitality was especially great, making it quite difficult to fatigue his body. Even so, he was reaching the end of his limits as well. He had used his mind to an extreme today, pushing his calculation abilities to the limit to ensure that every step was as perfect as possible. As for his body, it was in relatively better condition. However, he knew he had to do this. The Tor family was performing well, although not as well as the leaders. They had claimed a village that was currently still at the subgrade. However, other than this, their approach was a bit unique due to their size, or more accurately, the village had adjusted due to this. The Tor family was a family of giant-like humans. For them, being 2 meters tall was considered short, and most would be taller than 3 meters tall by the time they reached the 7th dimension. For the sake of fairness, the walls of the Tor family wouldn't possibly be the same size as that of other families. They would naturally build their structures much taller. As such, the Tor family had gained an advantage only similar giant families gained. After claiming their territory, the height of the walls doubled, as did their thickness. While they were still marginally weaker than the bronze grade, it wasn't by a large amount. As such, the Tor family wasn't obsessed with upgrades just yet, and focused on using their territory map to quickly find and clear challenges in dungeons. Thanks to this approach, they not only had villages with defenses comparable to the bronze grade, they had 2 of them in relatively close distance. Even so, Lionel didn't split his forces, he charged on just a single one. Chapter 1957. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 1957. Blazing battle intent. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1957. Blazing battle intent. Lionel sat in silence for a long while. He took deep breaths as 3 silver stars appeared to his back. They rotated slowly, large amounts of dream force seeping into his body. The recovery of his mind was especially so, but it was just enough. His eyes snapped open and he jumped, fluttering down from the skies amidst the stars. Attack! The appearance of Lionel and the others had already been noted, but far too late for the Tor to make large, advanced preparations. Among those that were still awake, many were simply scouts. As this was the first day and their nerves were sharp, they were relatively quick to react. But the range of a subgrade village was too short, and not everyone had the capital to spend on outposts like Lionel. At best, their warning was just enough for the Tor that were resting to jump from their beds, rushing forward in preparation for battle. Unsurprisingly, Armand was among them. With every step he took, the ground quaked. A twin pair of battle axes crossed on his back. He stood at just over 4 meters tall, and his muscles rippled like steel cords beneath his tough skin. The veins that protruded along his body were vibrant and a colorful bluish purple, with just the tiniest hints of golden flakes. One could almost see the blood rushing like tides within them, but one could most definitely hear the tsunami-like crashing waves that urged forward with his every movement. For such a tall person to appear in the human race, their entire physiology had to be properly changed. His bones were like steel pipes, his heart was like a rumbling engine, his nerves fired with great speed, his muscles were thick and powerful. When Lionel saw this man, he remembered the first time he had seen him. Back then, his snowy star owl blood had been completely suppressed. Not used to such a feeling, he had lost in their exchange of gazes. In reality, it couldn't be considered a loss. Lionel had frowned out of annoyance, and Armand had taken it as his victory, maybe rightfully so. It was probably also due to this that Lionel had made the decision to give up the convenience of having techniques to match with his lineage factor, and abandon the snowy star owl entirely. Even so, Lionel wasn't the type of person who liked to suffer such a loss. Maybe even Armand had already forgotten about this matter. After all, so many things had happened since then and Lionel had already proven himself several times over. But as though he had a fishbone stuck in the back of his throat, he had never forgotten this. At that moment, Lionel surged forward, his army flooding forward with him like a tide of darkness in the night. But very quickly, they lit up the battlefield as though it was midday. Sharp flashes of lightning echoing through the skies like ripples of sound waves. Lionel's 3 stars flickered and vanished, only to be replaced by 3 blue stars that were just as vibrant and shocking. His panda construct covered his body, and his divine armor snapped into place. Bang! He landed before Armand, the ground quaking as he punched out with 6 fists. Armand's expression was not good at this moment. He realized that he was outnumbered in a ratio worse than 10-1. And now Lionel was appearing before him when he and the few behind him were the only ones capable of changing the situation. Although Lionel had great numbers, there were no great geniuses among them. Armand could easily face 100 of them or more at a time alone. And that was only assuming that the rest would try to fight other battles. If there were no other burdens, he was confident in fighting all 10,000 on his own and killing them all. However, if Lionel blocked him, "You 4 go forward. I will deal with him as quickly as possible. Don't let our brothers die." Armand punched forward, expecting a strong fight, but the moment his fists connected with Lionel's, he frowned. Even when the other 2 pairs of fists landed on his torso, his frown only deepened. Too weak. Lionel's fists crackled, and his forward momentum came to a stop. Even as the vital star force pumped through his veins, he was forced 2 steps back. If not for the protection of his divine armor, his panda construct would have definitely lost at least 2 arms. Even his divine armor had hairline fractures on it. Although his divine armor was technically of the life grade, a grade that was noted to be the equivalent of the 8th dimension, it wasn't truly at this level. Lionel had simply comprehended a new state of crafting, allowing him to use lower dimensional materials to display strength of treasures far beyond. As such, when Lionel saw this, he wasn't surprised. Armand's gaze flashed, his expression turning ferocious as Lionel's 8 brothers and several other experts rushed forward to block his strongest backers. He could end his battle with Lionel quickly. In fact, he was a bit slow, now that he thought about it. As long as Lionel died or was forced to retreat, this victory would be theirs and they would gain over 10,000 kill exchanges on top of that. However, what Armand couldn't see was that Lionel's expression was absolutely calm. He could practically feel the excitement of the Tor and other families watching, believing that he had overestimated himself. A smirk curled his lips. He had crushed Nazag because the latter was an expert of the bow and he was a bow sovereign. What chance did he stand? Armand, however, was not only a genius at Nazag's level, but he had no obvious weaknesses against Lionel. It could be said that this would be Lionel's first true test since stepping into the air wars. The gap between the 6th and 7th dimensions was indeed obscenely large. But he had only used his fists just now. Since when was he a fist expert? Lionel's aura flourished. Star fusion combustion. The sapphire blue stars to Lionel's back suddenly blazed to life, becoming more akin to balls of fire than stars. At the same time, the vital star force rushing out from the joints and valves of his divine armor turned from royal blue to deep crimson as he grasped at the air, a large black rod appearing in his hands. "Show me why they call you all the Cataclysm generation." The last time I fought one of you, I was greatly disappointed. Lionel's battle intent blazed. Chapter 1958. Published at 28th of June, 2023. 1:06 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 1958. Aura. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1958. Aura. Two giants stood across from one another, their auras blazing. Lionel's black spear pulsed with dense black fog, rising like a tide and forming a twin pair of menacing blades. At the same time, Armand pulled his twin axes from his back, the veins along his forearms pulsing. Lionel's force rippled with a dense crimson. Armand's skin seemed to redden, a white steam coming off of him as his heart seemed to rev up like an engine. The two moved at once. Bang! The ground cracked, rippling force spreading out in all directions. Despite their size, they moved like wisps of wind. For most, the only way to keep track of them was to follow the trail of white and red. The colors intertwined, connecting and separating, spinning around one another and separating, sending one flying, and then the other reciprocating. Armand's gaze sharpened and his blood continued to heat up. After the first exchange, whatever excitement he had had for this battle had waned. He had a poor habit of being lazy. He couldn't seem to get up to do things unless there was a great battle in store for him. Not only his actions, but his face seemed to reflect this. He cared too little about many things. However, after the second exchange, and the third and the fourth, his eyes began to slowly redden. His muscles grew a size and a pair of horns began to slowly manifest from his head. It seemed that with every exchange, they would grow another inch, and with them, his strength would rise explosively. By the time they had grown to just over 2 feet, Lionel's combustion was being quickly suppressed. Even so, in that moment, the two of them suddenly laughed, a booming laughter that rumbled like thunder and struck like lightning. Bang! Lionel was sent reeling backward as Armand spread out his arms, his aura towering. The shimmering, but faint image of a creature loomed behind him. When it appeared, his body expanded by double its original size, his aura continuing to climb. On the outside, the Tor family elders sighed a breath of relief. In truth, they were quite helpless. Armand was the most talented junior to be born into their family in a very long time, maybe ever. But his laziness was a real problem. He should have been spoken about along with the likes of the sword deity and bow deity, but he couldn't be bothered. This state of his. This was the first time they had seen it in a very long time. They were surprised that it was Lionel who could bring this out of him, especially since, with their sharp eyes, they could tell that Lionel wasn't nearly enough to threaten him. At least not with the power he was using currently. However, Armand could sense something familiar from Lionel, a familiar sort of arrogance. It wasn't that Armand was lazy, it was rather that he didn't feel much was worth his effort. He wasn't interested in recognition, nor was he interested in accolades. His position in the Tor family had already stabilized the day he was born, so what was there to strive for? In fact, he was only participating in this battle because his elders had made him. But for some reason, he suddenly felt excited. Lionel clapped his second and third pair of hands together, causing a resonating shockwave to spread out in all directions. To his back, his 3 stars suddenly became 5, a pair of dark blue stars pairing with his 3 radiant bright blue stars. Armand swung both of his axes downward without the slightest hint of mercy in his eyes. A bloodlust leaked from his body. He seemed to have forgotten about everything, even his fellow family members. All he wanted was battle. The wind kicked up and Lionel's absolute spear domain suddenly manifested. However, it was decidedly different from usual. Rather than a simple radiant gold, it carried a dark blue heaviness to it. Armand found his twin axes slowing before he even made contact. Lionel's smile seemed to have vanished, and all that was left was an abrupt coldness. What excitement and pleasure that had been on his face seemed to have been entirely suppressed. Star fusion, King's might. Lionel's aura erupted once against, the dense crimson becoming an even denser violet. It felt as though a king had descended, the spear crown on his panda construct's 3 heads growing in size and magnificence. His spear pierced forward, vanishing through the void. Armand's heart skipped a beat. He hurriedly reversed the flow of his force, something that would have shredded apart the body of almost anyone else, but he seemed to do it with ease, blocking with all his might. Bang! Armand stumbled a step back, but Lionel had already retracted his spear and pierced forward again. At the same time, the motion of his second and third pair of hands shifted, a large accumulation of void star force appearing in the skies like surging flood dragons that descended with a deathly momentum. Swift. 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 Lionel's spear seemed to have changed entirely, its magnificence on full display. It felt as though he had just been toying around before. His previous attempts had entirely lacked the same elegance, the same oppression. Forceful. Bang. Armand's block was nearly thrown back entirely, his back bending at an awkward angle. The excitement blazing in his eyes only seemed to be increasing. His muscles pulsed so quickly that they seemed to vibrate. He dug his heels in the ground, his horns turning red under the heat his body was giving off. Roar. Holding his axes, he punched out, meeting the twin flood dragons of void star force. He seemed to completely ignore Lionel's spear as it approached and pierced into his chest. Bang! He was sent flying backward, his body arcing as he oriented himself in the skies and landed heavily. Suddenly his expression changed. Lionel's aura had changed once again. Before the eyes of everyone, the two dark blue stars began to quickly accumulate runes, its aura growing. Chapter 1959. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 1959. Emptiness. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1959. Emptiness. When Armand looked up, he could seem to see Lionel's gaze. Despite the armor, despite the panda construct, despite the rippling obstructions of force, he could still feel it. It was a gaze of dominance. A gaze that demanded submission. A gaze that wanted to crush the pride in his heart and force it into obedience. An absolute defense circulated around Lionel. An absolute offense graced the tip of his spear. And with a step, a flawless synergy seemed to be formed. The blade of his black spear grew and dwarfed Armand's blades in the blink of an eye. Kneel. It was just a single word, just a single syllable, just a single breath. However, the world seemed to change colors. When the tip of Lionel's spear appeared before him this time, Armand saw that it was bathed in a violet light as well. Sometimes, the essence of a spear technique didn't need a long phrase behind. Often an emotion didn't need a long explanation attached to it. Lionel's spear seemed to embody this, and it demanded surrender. The unwillingness bubbled up from deep with Armand, and his battle intent quickly turned to fury. Bang! At that moment, the shimmering image behind him solidified and grew with a towering majesty. The form of a golden minotaur stood. Its horns shimmered like two gems, its body looking as though it was carved of the most precious gems. All at once, the Tor ancestors rose to their feet, the excitement in their eyes practically boiling over. Armand's body grew yet another size, the veins coursing throughout his body pumping. In the past, there were only faint flecks of gold, but now, they radiated a dense golden energy as though liquid gold was coursing through his body. Armand roared and swung to meet Lionel's blade. Their weapons collided, and the world fell into silence for just a moment before everything seemed to be unleashed all at once. The ground beneath and around them was blasted apart, a large crater spreading out. The air snapped and crackled, and the region for countless kilometers was lit up by colors of gold and violet. Lionel felt a powerful resistance, but so too did Armand. The faces of his panda construct and Armand were practically nose to nose. They leaned forward, even somewhat crossing over their own weapons, as if they would rather headbutt than exchange blows with their blades. However, at that moment, Armand's blades gave way. Lionel's spear descended, slashing across his chest as though it was nothing more than wet paper. He severed flesh and bone as one, cutting into his lungs and heart. Armand collapsed to a knee, coughing up a mouthful of blood, and then another. The intent to battle was still blazing in his eyes, the golden idol to his back making that intent clear. But even with his usual healing factor, the wound refused to close. Lionel looked down toward the cracked battle axes in Armand's hands. They were excellent weapons, but unfortunately, they were only of the gold grade. After their first few exchanges, they had already shown signs of cracking and fracture. Although Armand had tried to protect them with his battle axe force, how could his weapon force be superior to Lionel's despite being in the seventh dimension? Lionel felt that it was a bit unfortunate. He could have stopped when he sensed Armand's axes giving way, or he could have used a weaker spear from the beginning, but he had refused to do so. These air wars weren't about his own selfish desires to do battle. His goal here was bigger. He was already indulging enough by fighting Armand alone, and not teaming up with Aina to finish it quickly in the first place. He couldn't indulge any more than that. There was a moment of silence as Lionel met Armand's gaze. "Good battle," he said plainly. Armand looked up without a word. Even though he was on a knee, he barely had to, his increase in size having been enough that even while down, he was almost the height of Lionel's panda construct. At that moment he could have crushed his badge and escaped, but seeing the slaughter of his clansmen around him, his eyes dimmed. For the first time his battle intent waned somewhat. The tip of Lionel's spear trembled once and Armand's head was severed from his shoulders. The Tor family fell into silence. Veins popped across their forearms and foreheads, the heat in their surroundings rising as their bloodlines thumped. The sound of their hearts, especially as they resonated as one, felt like rumbling and collapsing earth. Unlike the others, they took deep breaths and didn't say a word, but the red in their eyes, their growing horns and the quaking of their flagship painted a completely different picture. The echo of Lionel's words seemed to descend once more. The words of a king couldn't be retracted, and exceptions couldn't be made for them. Others might have thought that Lionel might spare Armand for the sake of a good battle, or because he had never wanted to be there in the first place, or because he felt a sort of resonance with him. But Lionel had never had any intention of doing that. As many came as many as he would kill. He looked up into the skies as though he could see the gazes of those that must have been paying attention to him right this moment. His momentum was undying. If it wasn't obvious already, it was as clear as day now. He had come with the intention of fighting against the world. On just the first day, Lionel had killed not just one genius of the Cataclysm generation, but two of them. These geniuses that should have been fighting it out for the final, ultimate glory, were unceremoniously slaughtered with the human domain as witness. The words of Lionel Morales were never and would never be spoken with any sort of emptiness. Chapter 1960. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 1960. Interesting. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1960. Interesting. Every action Lionel took seemed to remind him of the words he had spoken back then. Every genius that fell caused another pang of regret to light their hearts, another surging pain and unwillingness coursing through their veins. It was at that moment that some began to realize that Lionel had done this on purpose. Every time he killed, they would be reminded of their words, reminded of what could have been, reminded that everything that was happening now was their fault. Whether they acknowledged that in the future and didn't blame Lionel himself was entirely unknown. However, what was certain was that they would know the truth in their hearts. Armand had never wanted to enter the air wars to begin with. It was they who had made him, they who had ignored his wishes. He could have been home right this moment, lounging as he normally did. But now he was lying in a pool of his own blood. Ruthless, too ruthless. Ancestor Goldark said coldly. This time, he didn't bother to seek an answer from the Morales family. He only said this to stoke the flames. His Goldark family wouldn't be the only one to suffer. And if there was an opportunity to retaliate, they also wouldn't be alone. However, when he glanced over at the Morales ancestor, all he saw was pride in their eyes and sneers on their lips. This group of madmen didn't seem to give a damn. Gather up, Lionel's voice called out as he lowered his gaze from the skies. Well, begin the silver grade upgrade now. Yes. The Skies family members took deep breaths, but they weren't nearly at the end of their ropes yet. They had had overwhelming numbers, and though they had to team up for victory, this had helped them to save quite a lot of energy as well. They were prepared. They reformed their teams and gathered up. With silver-grade threats on the horizon, they would once again have a tough challenge ahead of them. And this time Lionel didn't have any terrain changers to use to his advantage. Even so, their numbers, with the support of his brothers, him and Aina, should be enough. The upgrade challenge was triggered and the battle ensued. As expected, it was far more challenging than the first time around. The Sky's family members, at least the majority of them, were only about as strong as bronze-grade threats, as if they could fight such an existence one-on-one. Only about 10% of them were as good as a silver-grade threat. The Oryx were different in this regard, which was why they were such a surprise to the people of the human domain. This relatively unknown race of people were mostly silver-grade threats, with about 10% of them being gold-grade threats. This aside, given the circumstances, it was unsurprising that the challenge was tough. This time, it was Lionel and his group that was at a disadvantage in number. Not only were they disadvantaged in terms of numbers, but they were also weaker overall. If Lionel's earlier actions had seemed insane, this was even beyond just that. His eagerness to gather a third city to complete the fusion was excessive. This was especially so given the fact that if he was struggling so much with a silver-grade upgrade, there was absolutely no way he would be able to deal with the gold-grade upgrade challenge anyway. Not only would the numbers they faced in the gold-grade upgrade challenge be at least 100 times more than the around 10,000 of the silver-grade, because it was a fusion path he was taking, it would be 3 times more than even that. On top of that, they would all be gold-grade threats. By this logic, it made no sense for Lionel to be pushing the limits like this. He shouldn't be able to enter the gold grade anytime soon anyway. However, at that moment, Lionel took a deep breath and closed his eyes. When they opened again, the fatigue within them was clear, but the determination was even clearer. These next few steps would be the ultimate deciding factor. 3 silver stars appeared to Lionel's back once more, and he roared into the skies. If one was standing to his back, it would be possible to see a silvery gold glow shimmering through the back of his neck. At that moment, one after another, countless troll beasts appeared in the skies, each valiantly wearing a coat of violet armor. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, then over 10,000. They had hardly settled down when Lionel's aura rose again. Roars echoed across the skies as one earth dragon after another began to appear, their enormous bodies blotting out the skies. They, too, looked exceptionally valiant, donning their own violet armor, their presences menacing as their hundreds of blade-like legs pierced down from the skies above. Lionel huffed and puffed, veins popping up across his forehead. At that moment, he used a kill exchange and summoned Little Blackstar. The little guy was only about 3 feet long, but he seemed to instantly become the center of the battlefield. "Crush them," Lionel said lightly. He threw everything he had forward. It was maybe only now that those watching understood that Lionel hadn't run out of trump cards just yet. In fact, the only new ability he had displayed just now was the summoning of a beast creature they had never seen before. The little mink looked unremarkable, but the moment he entered the fray, he didn't kill in batches any smaller than 10. Under the control of Lionel, silver-grade spirit constructs crashed against silver-grade beasts, monsters and trolls. The pressure against the Sky's family members was alleviated instantly. With Lionel's spirit constructs taking the front lines, their job couldn't have been easier. They looked for vulnerable creatures, and killed them while they were occupied. Strikes of lightning spread across the battlefield, and the battle soon came to an end. Lionel took deep breaths, his body seemingly reaching its limits as well. His mind couldn't help but wonder. This sort of feeling was created using nothing but dream force, that he was certain of. What was the secret behind it? And could he replicate it? Lionel claimed the city after spending millions to expand its region to 400 kilometers as well. His gaze flickered for a moment when he saw what the territory map had to offer. Interesting. Chapter 1961. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 1961. Fairy Tale. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1961 Fairy Tale. Lionel didn't move, standing in silence for a long while. His eyes were getting heavier, but he still pushed his mind to the absolute limit. After a moment he waved a hand. This time, another wave of about 200 or so Cloud Race members appeared. Among them, there was even the former secretary Marquisette Maya. Maya looked up toward Lionel with a cold gaze, but she didn't say anything. Her 2 sons were in Lionel's hands. There really was nothing that she could do. While she had planned to enter the special calm-like state of the cloud race, under Lionel's threat, she couldn't do this. You'll be him until I tell you otherwise. Lionel nudged ahead toward Armin's corpse. Maya took a glance and didn't say anything. But after a moment, her aura shifted and she grew to the point where she was almost an entire 2 meters taller than Lionel. At a glance, even with further inspection, she looked exactly like Armand without the slightest deviation in look or aura. Even her demeanor had become similar to his. Lionel hadn't expected this sort of accuracy from a corpse. There was definitely something special about the cloud race's ability to replicate others, more special than he knew. Disregarding this matter for now, Lionel sent the cloud race members away. They came as cloud race individuals and left as giants of the human race. A plan brewed in Lionel's mind as he watched them leave. The moment he had noticed that the Tor family had not just one, but 2 villages, another idea began to formulate in his mind. He shifted around some of his original plans and made some small adjustments. Maya would have originally been invaluable to clearing the coming gold grade upgrade challenge, but in her current spot, she was much more useful to him. Once this was done, Lionel claimed the now silver grade city, completing his trifecta. Now it was time to return and rest. By this point, all 10,000 of the Oryx should have gotten the rest they needed. Let's go. Lionel lit the region on fire. He wanted to give off the illusion that a great battle had been fought, but while the Tor lost 1 village, they managed to hold Lionel off and retreat to their second city. This displayed the strength Lionel wanted to give off while also making his trap easier to hop into. As of now, no one in the Air Wars knew that he had cloud race pawns on his side, and he would keep it that way for as long as possible. By the time his trap was sprung, he would be able to raise the day side to the ground and march toward the night side. Victory would be his. Although everyone saw Lionel's actions in impersonating the Tor family geniuses, there was nothing that they could do about it. Even the Morales family wasn't interfering with the event, and if they tried to secretly communicate, the first to notice would be Ancestor Hito. Everything was under their control, and cheating at this point was impossible. It would all come down to what preparations their youths had made ahead of time. Even so, seeing Lionel using the cloud race in this way no doubt made the Tor family absolutely furious. All the while, an incomplete and even false impression of the events was relayed to the Libra family heirs. Their grasp of the situation was limited to begin with. They could only see the aftermath of the event and conclude exactly what Lionel wanted them to conclude. Upon returning to the village, Lionel entered a pod. When he stepped out just 15 minutes later, those watching were surprised, but they had already seen the Oryx do this. They could only watch with ugly expressions as Lionel gained another huge advantage. Recall the troops marching in this direction, both of them. The messages were sent out swiftly, and they began their return. Lionel didn't want the troops he had sent out initially to interfere with the new Tor family. After all, if there was a troop in that area that the Tor, for some reason, didn't touch, it would be exposed as an oddity almost immediately. It was best that he regroup and reassign them. After Lionel sent out these orders, he gathered Aina and his brothers along with Raylion, Sail and the others as the Skies family took their turns in the pods. He marked out locations on the map and sent them out. Their targets were the dungeons that had used their now 3 territories to memorize the locations of. With the fact he had upgraded 3 regions to the silver grade now, they had not only spawned many more challenges, but many more dungeons as well, increasing the frequency of silver grade rewards. After sending them away, Lionel used yet another kill exchange to bring out little Tali. By this point, everyone seemed to have realized that Lionel was running out of subordinates. Right this moment, he had thousands of kill exchanges, and yet he didn't use them. Instead, he converted them all into points after bringing out Noah and some other geniuses of Earth. Even when it came to the cloud race he had sent to impersonate the Tor family, he only sent them the 500 points they needed to upgrade to the bronze grade, then left them to their own devices. As for the now over 11 million points he had now, they seemed to sit idle, burning a hole in his pocket. However, Lionel didn't seem to notice. One by one, he took out the items: the segmented cube, had spent the day completing. After handing the Sky's family their weapons and armors, he moved one to take out large bundles of what seemed to be simple plates without the slightest hint of engravings. Lionel's 3 stars appeared to his back, runes dancing across its surface as he leapt past his village walls, appearing in the depths of the mountain range that now surrounded them. He lifted his hands and controlled little Tali with one hand. In the other, he held a life-grade force crafting quill that could only be described as gorgeous. Although it was formed with an ink-blank feather, every time Lionel's wrist flickered and it trembled, golden dust would sparkle down from its body, making it look as though it had come out of a fairy tale. Chapter 1962. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 1962. The Ocean. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1962. The Ocean. None had ever seen Lionel Forcecraft before. He had left everything to the segmented cube until this moment. From the beginning, most had assumed that Fifth Nova was the most talented crafter of them all, and that Lionel was probably the most talented in combat. Most didn't understand the intricacies of the divine armor technique, and as such couldn't make accurate deductions about them. Only the Morales family understood for certain that it must have been Lionel who created his life-grade armor. For others, it was easier to assume that there must be a different sort of explanation. However, no one had expected Lionel to go from a path of murder to one of crafting supremacy. His demeanor seemed entirely the same, and yet his actions couldn't have been any different. It felt like his quill had become a spear, carving out everything in its path and crushing all it came across. Lionel's drawn force arts could only be said to be perfect. His finger designation left afterimages in the air as his hands danced across the skies. Lionel tossed a plain plate of silver metal into the air. Little Tali snaked forward, enveloping it as Lionel's fingers tapped at the air. The crushing sound of the sound barrier shattering again and again resounded as Lionel's fingers only seemed to become faster and faster. Little Tali responded in kind, the plate of metal becoming long and wire-wide before folding over itself and stretching out again. With his other hand, Lionel's force arts appeared one after another. They danced in the wind like fluttering butterflies. Each had their own unique expression, breathing life into the surroundings. The weathered grass beneath his feet became more vibrant, and the wind smelled sweeter. In the end, a long, curved bar appeared and the force arts shot forward, embedding themselves and sinking into the metal rod as though they had always been one. With a thought, Lionel planted the curved rod into the ground, perfectly connecting it with the one he had finished last. As he moved across the exterior of his village, moving up and down the mountainous region, and even diving into the long rivers he had created with the irrigation reward, a picture slowly began to form in the heads of those watching. Lionel was setting up a formation. Not only was he setting up a formation, but he was setting it up alone, and without even the slightest deviation and error. By the time he was finished, the sun had begun to appear over the horizon as dawn presented itself to the world. As Lionel set down the last bar, a ripple spread out in all directions. The formation solidified just as the Umbra family began to return one after another. Lionel listened to their reports one by one, building up a solid understanding of the day side of the formation. However, there was something that he was quite interested in, so he looked toward Radley's for an explanation. No one seems to have stepped foot into the water on the surface. There are no signs of any waterfront villages being claimed. Even the water force prominent families are taking their time. Lionel's gaze narrowed. The water was difficult to deal with. It was hard to tell what might be down there. Lionel had thought about expanding in that way specifically because it was difficult, but he changed his mind in the end. It wasn't worth it. The effort it would take didn't end up being worthwhile according to his simulations. However, Lionel knew that there would be others who had similar thoughts. Controlling the waterways might become a huge pitfall in the future. In that case, that means there are only small groups dealing in the waters currently. I also assume that the Pisk and Quarius families are expanding in that direction. Radley's nodded. Yes. Although they didn't start there, they are definitely making a move toward it. It also seems that they've sent small groups, just like you've said. However, their targets are clearing the challenges and dungeons no one else can reach. Lionel nodded. The air wars were meant to reflect the challenges in the real world. One only needed to look toward Earth to understand how difficult it was for fledgling worlds to deal with oceanic creatures and territories. If Earth hadn't terraformed and built a supercontinent, their trouble after the metamorphosis would have been countless times worse. Now that trouble was being reflected here. One might wonder why the ocean was so much more trouble than land, and there were multiple reasons. The first was the obvious fact. Humans couldn't breathe in water. Although force could replace it for a time, that wouldn't be indefinite. It also didn't help that the density of water force in the ocean meant that it was practically the only force available to absorb, and you would need special affinity with water force to separate out the forces you wanted from its special brand of neutral force. The second was the vastness and the relative secrecy. It was far too large and there were too many secret corners and crevices. Even Emperor Fox hadn't managed to find an easy way to deal with the ocean. The third was strength. Creatures that could withstand the water pressure of the ocean, especially after the metamorphosis, were all bound to be exceptional. There was no great change in gravity in the beginning, and any changes were slight and gradual. However, such slight changes could result in exponential changes in water pressure in the deepest reaches of the ocean. In addition, there was another glaring issue that fit into this third category: invalids. Emperor Fox had wiped almost all invalids in a single move. Invalids on the surface, that is. Falling Paradise Islands might have caused devastating effects on the land, but in the ocean, given its depth, there was only so much their falls could have done. This made the ocean a prime location for the fostering of beast invalids, and more shockingly than that, beast variant invalids. It was unknown whether or not Ancestor Hito would actually use invalids. It was doubtful. But he would make the difficulty of the ocean reflect real life, that much was certain. Lionel knew this, and as such, it was on his list of things to monitor despite the difficulty in doing so. Author's note. Bad news looms over the horizon. Potentially just 2 chapters today. As always, will do my best to get no 3 out. Chapter 1963. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1963. Too late if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1963. Too late. There was nothing much that could be done about the ocean for now. The only method forward was patience and prudence. That said, when it came to the other tidbits of information that he could do something about, Lionel summons another wave of Cloud Race members. This time, his orders were hyper-specific and targeted. In fact, they felt even more detailed than even the information the Umber family had given him. Radlees, however, was slowly getting used to working with Lionel. He understood that this man was one who didn't like to explain things. In all likelihood, he had already had an idea of what he wanted to do even before sending the Cloud Race members out. Go and rest. After you've recovered, you and the others will head to the other supercontinent. Ignore the ocean for now, but note anything out of the ordinary. Lionel said before looking up. It's about time. With the sun rising on this side, it could be night on the opposing side of the moon now. This was the perfect time for the Umber family to take action. Even if Lionel was on this half, he had no intention of neglecting the other. He had eyes on complete supremacy. While it was true that his performance until now was already enough to justify his arrogance and boldness, giving the Morales family quite a bit of momentum, he wasn't nearly satisfied enough. As he had said, this was nothing more than the precursor. Lionel's figure flickered, appearing in the core region of the village. His gaze was sharp and his heart calm. The fatigue was already beginning to accumulate between his brows once again, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it had been previously. It seemed that he almost took crafting as a time of leisure rather than an intrusively difficult activity. Many had begun to pay attention to other things while Lionel was crafting the formation. There were too few who understood force crafting truly. It was only those of the Omen family and the Morales family who couldn't take their eyes away, but even then their relative reactions were far different. A deep frown marred Ancestor Radrian's brows. The skill that Lionel was displaying didn't make any sense to him. The precision, the meticulousness, even the faint inklings he had grasped toward his potential intentions, they all didn't seem to be something a junior of the sixth dimension should have been capable of. He would just barely be able to accept it if Lionel was the same age as the others, but if his information was correct, Lionel wasn't even 30 years old yet. In fact, he was quite a number of years from that age. How could he do this? As for the Morales family, they saw things on an even deeper layer. One would have thought that Lionel had allowed the segmented to only forge the more complicated treasures like armors and weapons. But hours ago, when he first took out those plates, the eyes of the Morales ancestors couldn't help but light up. Those plates weren't just forged of a single metal. They were instead a composite of them, a beautifully refined alloy. But what was especially shocking was that even with their sharp eyes, it took them several hours of observation to realize this. Of course, they had known that it had to be something special because it was a metal they didn't recognize. With their wisdom and years of experience, how could there possibly be an or they didn't recognize? But it was also because of that confusion that they realized how beautifully forged this alloy was, so perfect that it made them doubt themselves. This metal alloy, without a doubt, had reached the level of the life grade. It had reached a level where it seemed that nature itself had created it. When the ancestors realized this, they also came to understand just what Lionel had planned. He was using a self-created alloy as the foundation for this formation he was creating, which also meant that this formation, whatever it was also self-created. However, even with this being the case, when they saw Lionel enter the central core of the village, their hearts couldn't help but skip several beats. This was insane. That was all they could describe it as. Although Lionel's choice to challenge the bronze and silver grades were crazy to the majority, that was mostly because many still saw him as a sixth-dimensional existence back then. If it had been Armand, or the sword deity, or Adderworth who had forced through such challenges, they could still accept it. That was because in the worst scenario, these geniuses could take center stage and force victory using their own power. But when it came to the gold grade, no matter how you looked at it, it was simply impossible for one to do that on their own. And there was no sudden landscape change that could help now either. And even if there were, given the sheer number of enemies that could be coming. Even if Lionel could somehow manifest another mountain from thin air, it simply wouldn't be enough to deal with them all. There were already over 12,000 enemies in the Silver Grade Upgrade Challenge. The number to face in the Gold Grade Upgrade Challenge would be 100 times that at over 1,000,000. To make matters worse, Lionel would have to face 3 times that amount. Right now, even after recalling 2 troops of Oryx, Lionel only had 4,000 subordinates. If he included the Skies family who had recovered by now, that was 14,000. And even if he included the 10,000 or so souls he had claimed from, that was still not even 1% of the number of enemies he would be facing soon. As though that wasn't enough, on top of that, he had sent his strongest individual combatants away. Whether it was Aina, James, Elther, Noah, or the others, they were currently away on the tasks Lionel had set aside from them. At this point, even the Morales ancestors wanted to reach through the screen and tell him to stop. But it was already too late. Lionel brought out his other 2 city cores and threw them forward. Chapter 1964. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1964. Worries if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1964 worries. The ground began to rumble. The near immediate commotion was so great that it made Lionel's ears ring. Even so, he walked out from the core of the village calmly. Take your positions on the wall. The rest will be left up to me, Lionel said lightly. The Skies family and the Oryx were already in position. However, the way they took up their positions could only be said to be odd. Along the walls, there were only enough positions for a few hundred of them. With what could only be described as precise organization, they formed lines behind these positions, only one stepping up and onto the wall at a time. At the same time, at the end of the line, a sleeping pod was lined up. These first few hundred in the first batch positioned themselves behind railguns that reminded them eerily of the one Alan had used previously to hold off the Constellation Bow Alliance. However, these somehow seemed more complete. Despite seeing this, the worry on the brows of the Morales family elders only deepened. What were a few hundred railguns going to do? Even if it was thousands, it wouldn't be enough. These beasts were created to not have consciences. They didn't care about how many of their allies were dying, and they only felt bloodlust. Their only thoughts were of rushing forward as quickly as possible, and reaping as many lives as they could. Even if 100,000 fell, another 100,000 would be right there to replace them. Even if it was the last 100,000. They had no concept of morale or momentum. Normal war tactics simply wouldn't work. These upgrade challenges were designed to mimic the real-life patterns of invalids. There was simply no simple way to deal with them, and lining the walls with a few guns just seemed foolhardy. These upgrade challenges were designed to mimic the real-life patterns of invalids. There was simply no simple way to deal with them, and lining the walls with a few guns just seemed foolhardy. The only saving grace was that if the upgrade failed and the walls fell, Lionel could at least run away, but that would also unleash these millions of invalids on the continent. At the same time, that would ruin all of Lionel's progress and his advantages would vanish into thin air. At this point, even those who wanted Lionel to fail didn't say anything. They didn't feel there was a point, the outcome felt inevitable. However, whether this was an outcome that Lionel wanted or not was what they were on the fence about. Now that they thought about it, maybe Lionel had sent his most powerful combatants away on purpose. What if this was another scheme of his? This worry had resulted in them remaining silent. It seemed that Lionel's previous successes had left their scars. Even at this point, many were hesitant to make their final judgments. As Lionel stepped into the air calmly, his expression indifferent and his coarse linen shirt and pants ruffling in the wind, his confidence seemed to be palpable. The ground continued to rumble as Lionel continued to rise into the air, a simple silver-gold platform of emulation spatial force becoming his seat as he flew several hundred meters into the air. He closed his eyes, seemingly unable to sense the rumbling ground at all. However, his lips slightly parted. "Fire," Lionel said lightly. His voice was soft amidst the rumbling, and yet it traveled to each one of their ears. The few hundred on the walls gripped the handles of their railguns tight, swinging them forward. A black sea of enemies appeared not even a kilometer away. Their roars and clanging weapons grated on the ears, a suffocating heat and bloody scent quickly rising through the air. They seemed endless, felt boundless. And then the first railguns fired. Sparking lightning howled and solid rays of golden-yellow lasers streaked across the air, their projectiles hidden within. The first volley connected with the front line, causing a rain of blood and gore to surge into the skies. Just a single ray seemed to take out dozens before it was eventually blocked. After a collective volley, thousands had fallen. The railguns swung once more, lightning sparking once again as they fired. The loading process seemed smooth and seamless. Once again, another few thousand died. However, what was a few thousand to several million? And to make matters worse, after just 2 volleys, the marksmen were already pale. Most would only be able to withstand just a single more volley, while all of them only have a maximum of 4 to give. The situation seemed helpless, and yet Lionel's voice descended calmly. Swap. The lines shifted forward. The first group fell back and rushed to enter the resting pods, and a new marksman stepped in on each railgun. Renewed and rejuvenated, the firing continued at the same rhythm, not a single beat was missed. By the time the army had closed the distance by half, almost 10 volleys had been sent and over 50,000 had died. There was no doubt that Lionel's approach was effective, but it still felt like it wasn't nearly enough. But it was at this moment that Lionel slowly opened his eyes. They didn't seem sharp. In fact, they seemed almost dull and lifeless, almost as though his attention was elsewhere. Down below, the army was only 100 or so meters away from crossing the first line of his formation, and he was ready and prepared. 3 silver stars appeared to Lionel's back, slowly rotating as large amounts of dream force rushed into his body, replenishing his mind and soothing his soul. Then, one after another, familiar valiant souls began to appear on the battlefield. Donned in violet battle armor, they seemed prepared to face the world. Even so, when they appeared, the hearts of the Morales family elders sank. If Lionel had done something else, anything else, they would have still had some hope. But they had already seen this trick before. It had already been pushed to the limits when Lionel had to take on his most recent silver grade upgrade. What good would it be here? Despite this, Lionel couldn't seem to sense the worries of anyone else. 2 more stars appeared to his back, runes beginning to dance across its surface. The temperature skyrocketed as the twin pair of red-gold balls of fire appeared. At that moment, one after another, the eyes of the soul constructs below suddenly began to blaze with fire as well. Scarlet Star Force. Chapter 1965. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 8 seconds p.m. Chapter 1965. Reel if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1965 Reel at that moment. The demeanor of the soul constructs completely changed. No, it was more accurate to say that it felt as though 10,000 Lionels had appeared at once, all powerful and all equally as real. All at once, they raised their palms and 10,000 bows appeared. These weren't soul constructs or creations of emulation spatial force. They were real, tangible bows that could have only been forged by the segmented cube. Although each one only exuded the aura of the bronze grade, when they entered the palms of the soul constructs, they suddenly became the weapons of a king. They drew their bowstrings back at once, their backs straight, and their gazes sharp. The instant the first line of army crossed the formation line, they fired. The speed of firing for Lionel and his soul constructs was far faster than any volleys the human domain had seen until now. Scarlet Star Force tore through everything in its path, burning everything it touched. The violent destruction made any previous carnage look like nothing more than a joke. Every time another troll fell, a slight ripple would pass through the formation, resurrecting their soul. After a small moment, 2 balls of fire would flicker to life in their eyes, and they would suddenly become completely different people. It very quickly became obvious that Lionel wasn't using his soul constructs as usual. As time passed, the worry that weighed down the hearts of the Morales ancestor was slowly becoming lighter and lighter. They stood in a daze, their eyes locked onto the youth sitting cross-legged in the skies. Very few knew that Lionel had Scarlet Star Force. The matters that happened that day in the Raypack's nest had been practically ignored by the members of the Cataclysm generation, and not much of this had spread. Coupling this with the fact that Lionel had been within the Void Palace when he displayed much of these abilities, and the wider human domain was even more in the dark. It was impossible to see even a top 3 force in any given category, but Lionel had already made use of the number 1 water force and the number 1 fire force. What was even more shocking than that was the fact that this Scarlet Star Force was on a level that made even the hearts of the ancestors tremble. Was this power a 6th-dimensional existence should have? Eventually, the line of defense was overwhelmed. The flood of enemies was simply too many. Lionel's bows alone, even 10,000 of them, couldn't counter them completely. However, Lionel's expression didn't change in the slightest, the same dull, glass-like look remaining. In that moment, his soul constructs tossed their bows to the side and flipped their palms to reveal spears. Each one of these spears was of a different caliber, and yet revealed absolutely shocking auras one after another. Not a single one of them was short of the life grade. So many powerful spears could only come from one place, and that was when a shocking realization shook the human domain. No matter how powerful the spear domain ring, one could only use a single spear at a time. However, somehow Lionel had completely shattered this concept. The resonating howls of thousands of life-grade spears shook the earth and dispersed the clouds above. It felt like the army of millions wasn't the coming tide, but rather the group of soul constructs standing in silence. In their mires, Conrad the Morales ancestors looked toward the old and wrinkled man, and were stunned to see a bright smile on his face. Even amongst the ancestors, there were hierarchies, and Ancestor Hito was without a doubt amongst the most senior and most respected. Ancestor Alvaro had been a toddler when he first saw this man, and he was already an ancestor back then. He was simply on a completely different level. Not once had they ever seen this old man smile, and here he was grinning from ear to ear. This formation is a stroke of genius. We will probably never understand its intricacies without also comprehending the lineage factor that littlest nova is using to give it such strength, but the general gist of it is clear. It disperses and amplifies dream force. Its function is that simple, and can be summarized in just those few words. However, what's especially ingenious about it is the fact that this dream force isn't casually constructed dream force, nor does it come from the atmosphere. If I am correct, littlest nova's original ability index doesn't allow him to project dream force. Instead, he's using this formation as a proxy for his mind and his soul, blanketing the entire region and treating the entire region as his limbs. Dream force seems like an enigmatic concept to most, but that's only to those who had no affinity for it. Do you know why dream force is so dangerous? Why coming into contact with it is a life-changing and often ending event? It's because dream force is an unruly child. It simply flows as it pleases, finding vessels that it wants to invade. When this dream force is ownerless, one ends up in an endless cycle of memories. However, what if it was owned? What if this dream force was under the control of another? What if this own dream force ran into an easily manipulated and malleable soul construct? Those soul constructs are no longer who they once were. For all intents and purposes, they are littlest nova. They are more real than any clone in existence has ever been. Chapter 1966. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 6 seconds p.m. Chapter 1966. Another. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1966. Another. Through these clones, Lionel could extend his affinities. It felt like his mage core had multiplied over several thousand times, allowing him to call down atmospheric force from thousands of locations at once. With his stars as an anchor, it further allowed him to extend the ability to use Scarlet Star Force to each and every one of his soul constructs. However, even this was only the tip of the iceberg. It felt that rather than controlling his clones, he was rather controlling extra limbs of his. With those souls as the mediums, all of Lionel's archery skills, all of his spearmanship, all of his mage and knight abilities cascaded forth, crushing everything they ran into. Every time another enemy fell, yet another warrior would be added to the total. They rose up with flickering crimson flames in their eyes, marching forth with a deathly momentum. From time to time, hundreds of railguns would fire at once, taking out dozens more each. Even when Lionel's clones were enveloped by a strike, they would ripple once and collapse, only to reform and begin their slaughter once again. Without having to worry about crushing allies, the Skies family and the Oryx released volley after volley, draining themselves and then retreating to the back of the line before the process started all over again. Any projectile that could drain a seventh-dimensional existence in just 3 attempts was bound to be supremely powerful. Because Lionel wasn't worried about their recovery, he had gone all out. Even the current him could only fire those railguns a dozen or so times before he had nothing left. That was why he hadn't bothered to execute the crafting of more than a few hundred. All of a sudden, it wasn't Lionel's combat prowess that was on full display, but rather his crafting. The danger he posed to those of the human domain skyrocketed. This was an individual who was not only highly intelligent, he was likewise highly talented and powerful. On top of that, unlike his father who could only be described as a headstrong loner, Lionel seemed to be an exceptional leader who was willing to rely on others to execute his orders. He was nothing short of a monster. Lionel gasped for breath, his dull gaze regaining its sharpness as his platform of emulation spatial force wavered. He truly looked like he had nothing left to give, but by now, there were only a few thousand gold-grade threats remaining and his army of soul constructs had already grown to millions. Even if Lionel could no longer control them, dealing with the rest was like using a steamroller to crush an egg. Lionel landed on the ground, his chest heaving. Every breath he took seemed to cause a hurricane-like event, the rushing wind falling into the endless abyss that was his lungs. The good news about having such great vitality was that reaching this point of fatigue was almost impossible. The bad news was that when he did, recovering was far more difficult for him than it was for most. Even so, Lionel looked forward as a wave of gold spread across his territory. their range increasing from 400 kilometers to 500 kilometers. By this point, what once was the light of dawn was already beginning to wane as evening approached. The battle had taken quite a period of time, and many changes could have taken place in this time. Even so, Lionel dragged his body into a pod and didn't exit until an hour later, the equivalent of 4 days of rest. At this moment, his soul constructs still stood in silence, like wisps of violet in the wind that could be blown to dust at any moment. They'll last at most about 15 or so hours. That's enough time. Lionel took a deep breath. The strength of his soul constructs would only be able to mirror his own strength when they were within his formation. However, outside of his formation, they would revert back to their original combat strength. That said, this wasn't terrible for multiple reasons. Firstly, that majority of them were gold grade now, making them quite effective and powerful. Although they couldn't match up to the heirs, they were stronger than many subordinates, or at least on par with many of them. Secondly, while it sounded nice to be able to perfectly control them as though they were his limbs, doing so drained a great deal of his stamina. If Lionel let them fight on their own, the stamina he would save was enormous. Lionel's figure flickered, and he entered the core of the village. In truth, it could no longer be called a village now, it was well and truly a city, and the core of it reflected that. The ceilings were tall, the pillars were thick, and now Lionel could sit upon a throne to investigate the changes to the core. As expected, his outposts had upgraded and now had the added function of instant teleportation. This would save them a great deal of time and effort. Lionel now had over 3 million kill exchanges burning a hole in his pocket. That many gold-grade kill exchanges were worth 30 billion points. Though this was short of the 500 billion points he would need to upgrade this city into an air-grade one, it was still a substantial sum. Without hesitation, Lionel attempted to use 1 billion points to expand his city limits from 500 kilometers to 2,000. However, he realized instantly that there was a blockage. The first blockage was to his back, about 600 or so kilometers away, or about 100 kilometers from his border, there was the ocean. According to this system, he wasn't allowed to expand his territory limits into the ocean without an underwater territory. The other blockages, to his sides and toward the front, were other territories. It turned out that the reason he had been able to see the location of the second Tor territory was because its owner, Armand, had already died. As such, it had been ownerless at the time. But he couldn't just steamroll territories with his own by buying more. Even so, Lionel grinned. He had found another loophole. Comment view all. Chapter 1967. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 4 seconds p.m. Chapter 1967. 80% if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1967. 80% during that attempt to expand territory. The failure points were clearly noted. Although it was only for a brief moment, and the option to expand had already been grayed out. Just how good was Lionel's memory, exactly? Although the Umbra family had already given him the location of the most important territories, they happened to be the largest and most prominent. In the end, there were only a few hundred Umbra family members that had come. Given the scope of the air wars, it was difficult for them to get everything. Of course, the Umbra family had far from just this many seventh-dimensional existence beneath 100 years old, but convincing them to bring out a few hundred in the first place already took quite a bit of convincing. One had to remember that the Umbra family was meant to be a weak sixth-dimensional family. Having just a single seventh-dimensional existence was already a big deal, let alone a few hundred. It had to be remembered that back then, even their patriarch, Xylem Umbra, wasn't even at Tier 4 of the 6th dimension yet. This meant that Lionel could only work with what he had, which was also why it had felt to Radleys that Lionel was working with information they hadn't even given him. That was because all this time, Lionel had been piecing together a picture of the day side based on several sources. The Umbra family was only one of those sources, and now he had gained another. There was another matter to consider as well. The Umbra family was already currently on the night side, gathering up intel. It had been over a quarter day since Lionel saw them last. With how fast things were moving, there had most definitely already been changes to the information they had given him. This was a huge boon. Excellent. Expand to the greatest limit, Lionel confirmed. At that moment, a whooshing sound extended and Lionel's territory expanded an extra 100 kilometers toward his back, an extra 200 to the east and west, and finally, the largest change, an extra 600 to the north. It was unsurprising that there was such a large gap to the north, as that was the direction of both the former Constellation Bow Alliance and the Tor family. It was ironically his own territory, the one he had sent the cloud race to impersonate, that had stopped him from expanding forward. That said, it was also because he had sent the Oryx to clear out several regions in all locations that he had this much room to his left, right and back as well. His preparations had given and taken to them. In addition to this, Lionel had learned something else. Apparently, it was only by upgrading to the air grade could he forcefully assimilate territory. However, that wouldn't help with the ocean. Essentially, he would be able to claim the entire supercontinent if he reached the air grade. But even for Lionel, he knew that this was pushing it. He had just given everything he had to clear the gold grade. Although he could rely on his more powerful people like Aina, James and the others, it would truly be a tall mountain to climb. The air challenge was different. Firstly, the enemies would still mostly be at the gold grade, however there would be around 10 million of them rather than just over 1 million like before. In addition, rather than being a random tidal wave, they would be led by 100 air-grade generals designed to mimic variant invalids. They would be an organized army and threat, and their commanders would be at an air level. It wasn't something that Lionel could take casually, even if he made great preparations. It should be about now. The timing is right. Just as Lionel had this thought, the flash of several teleportations took shape as figure after figure began to appear within the core throne room of the city. Once again, Lionel's timing was immaculate. At this moment, James, Emna, as well as Aina, his brothers and the others had all returned. None of them seemed surprised that Lionel had cleared the gold grade without them. This had always been the plan. Lionel turned toward them and nodded. Tell me about your gains and then go rest in the pods. We will move out again within the hour. James and Emna came forward first. The two of them had been away for the longest and had the most accumulated gains. At the same time, they were the two in most need for rest, so it was only right that they came forward first. Between the two of them, they had accumulated over 50 million points, a shocking total. This would already be enough for one to challenge their gold grade upgrade. While compared to Lionel's current almost 30 billion, it wasn't worth much. The fact that they had gotten so much just clearing bronze and silver grade challenges and dungeons spoke volumes about how much effort they had put in. That said, Lionel was less concerned about the points and more concerned about the rewards themselves. It was a silver grade dungeons reward that had given Lionel the advantage in clearing the silver grade upgrade condition without many subordinates. He couldn't neglect such rewards. Lionel quickly shifted through the rewards they had gained and made several calculations. Between the two, they had cleared about a dozen dungeons each, most of which were silver grade. Although they didn't always get the air grade reward, due to various circumstances unrelated to their combat strength, they had gotten it the majority of the time as well. A tunnel reward. A silver grade instant pass reward. A territory protector reward. A wall collapsing reward. A territory masking reward. Suddenly, Lionel's eyes lit up. This could be useful, very useful. He had seen another potential loophole, and this could change a great deal of things. If he was correct and used this reward appropriately, he should be able to extend his territory into the ocean. But even he wasn't certain if this loophole would work with 100% certainty. There should be about a 80% chance. Worth it to try. Chapter 1968. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 4 seconds p.m. Chapter 1968. Decision: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1968 decision. Lionel plucked the reward and rolled it between his fingers for a moment. Then, with a thought, he pushed it toward the core of the city and agreed to accept the change. After a wild bout of vertigo, everyone opened their eyes to smell an air that was decidedly more humid, refreshing and salty. Even from here, they could hear the sounds of the crashing waves. Without even looking out of the city, they could tell that they had all suddenly been moved to the ocean side. Lionel didn't flinch after this happened, he had already expected it. Without hesitation, he pushed forward a second reward and accepted it as well. The ground rumbled and the sound of heavy rocks crashing into the ocean resounded. Many who didn't know what was going on rushed to the city walls and their eyes widened as they felt that the city was about to fall right off a cliff and into the raging waters below. However, just when it seemed that this would happen, the city stabilized and became rock solid. Waters rushed in from the side, and the moat that had surrounded the city before was filled instantly with a rush of heavy salt water. It felt like, in that moment, the city was enveloped by the embrace of the ocean. The mountain range they had been hidden within was completely gone, and they found themselves on soft, sandy land. If not for the fact that this was a simulation and not completely analogous to real life, there was no way such a heavy structure could exist on such fragile land. At the same time, they had been right near a cliff face which had now crumbled and collapsed, lowering their elevation and causing a rush of ocean water to tide in. Their city was now half perched on sand and another half in the ocean, and with their moat, they felt a step away from being entirely submerged. In order to accomplish this, Lionel had done two things. The first was that he used a territory-moving reward. Since it was just silver grade, it only allowed him to move his territory to anywhere within his territory's range. However, given the size of his territory to begin with, that gave him access to over half the supercontinent. Then he used yet another terrain change reward, but this one, rather than being used for mountains, was instead used to direct waterways. Its original purpose was to create a source of water by extending it from a primary source. So, Lionel used it on the ocean and extended it into their moat. Only underwater territories were allowed to expand into the ocean. Well, was he not technically underwater now? His city limits had been entirely submerged in ocean water. Even if Lionel was just trying his luck, using these rewards like this still only benefited him. Although he had abandoned the mountain range, attacking his territory like this was even more difficult because you could only send an army from a single direction now. In addition to the fact the moat was even heavier. But it seemed that Lionel wouldn't have to worry about only having this to gain. When he saw that his territory map now extended into the depths of the ocean, he almost couldn't refrain from grinning ear to ear. The ocean was vast, just as vast as any one of the supercontinents, so Lionel wasn't anywhere near close to mapping it all out. His territory should have extended 2,000 kilometers from his city now, or rather, however far it could go before it ran into other territories, but territory distance was counted differently within the ocean. There seemed to be a 100 times reduction. Lionel wasn't surprised by this. On land, territory only had to account for 2 dimensions, but with the water, depth had become very important. Now his territory map wasn't flat, but it also had to incorporate a distance down to the greatest depth of the ocean. But even then, because he had 2,000 kilometers, to 20 kilometers in this case, in perfect detail, the things he could see were almost too much. The ocean's depth ranged from 5 kilometers to 20 kilometers. This was far deeper than a moon of this size should have had, but it was likely that ancestor Hito had done this on purpose. Challenges and dungeons appeared at all depths, and because of the difficulty in reaching them, they were far more tightly packed. In just this 20-kilometer range that Lionel could see, there were already over 200 challenges and over 4 dozen dungeons. Half of those were bronze grade, about a quarter were silver grade. However, there were over 40 gold grade challenges and almost 10 were air grade. At the same time, there were over 15 gold grade dungeons and 5 air grade ones. To put this into perspective, the land had yet to even spawn gold grade challenges and dungeons. Only now that Lionel's territory had become gold grade would it start to. This was completely game-changing. As though this wasn't enough, Lionel had also spotted the territory of several air-grade oceanic beasts as well. Each one of them was worth 100,000 points so long as they were killed. This is a huge treasure trove. If others tapped into this, all of the effort I put into getting ahead would be completely crushed. I expected this possibility, but it's even more exaggerated than I assumed. Lionel narrowed his eyes. He was very much correct. Right now, the Pisk and Quarius families were behind, But once they entered the ocean, their advantages would skyrocket with great speed. In just a few steps, they would go from the bottom ranks of constellation families to amongst the top ranks. Even so, the advantage that Lionel had was even greater. Who could afford to buy 2,000 kilometers worth of territory right now in exchange for 20 kilometers worth of information? Beyond that, he was even planning on pouring all 30 billion points he had not into underwater outposts to extend this range. The gold-grade underwater outposts each cost 10 million, and each one had a range of just 1 kilometer, but if 20 kilometers of space had this much information, how much would 300 kilometers have? Lionel didn't care about points right now. There were only a few things he could spend them on to begin with. However, if he managed to monopolize a large number of air-grade dungeons, the rewards he gathered from them could put him so far ahead that the air wars would become meaningless. If the silver-grade rewards for these dungeons were already so useful, what could the air-grade ones do for him? Lionel's expression flickered. He had a decision to make. He currently had over 3 million soul constructs that would only last for a few more hours. He knew that they wouldn't be enough to conquer the supercontinent, but he did know that they would be enough to wreak havoc. He was very understanding about the strength of the heirs. If the gold grade upgrade was 1 million, that meant that very soon, the heirs would be able to deal with it. And if he made such a large commotion, he would attract public ire even sooner, not to mention make it even easier for them to deal with it by giving them a reason to band together. If he could separate out this army of 3 million, it would be one thing. But they were soul constructs held together by his lineage factor. He had to be there to direct them, and he couldn't move his formation freely to use clones as a stand-in. The other option was, of course, to press his advantage and claim as many gold and air-grade rewards as possible, so that when he was eventually ganged up on anyway, they wouldn't stand a chance. Lionel fell into his thoughts. He couldn't afford a misstep. Chapter 1969. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:06 and 1 p.m. Chapter 1969. How? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1969. How? Lionel raised his head, a flash of what felt like violet lightning coursing through his irises. Not every step could be meticulous and perfect. Not every scheme could be without pitfalls. Without perfect information, even he couldn't guarantee a result. His simulations were only as good as the data he put into them. In that case, he would have to force the issue, suffocate his enemies until they didn't have the option to add variables to his calculations in the first place. Go and rest. Catch up when you can. I'm setting out now. The gazes of those present flashed, but they didn't say anything. In these air wars, Lionel had the final say and they had already accepted it. If they hadn't, they wouldn't be following him in the first place. Lionel stepped out, casually waving a hand and using the territory protection award that the others had gathered. These rewards summoned a protector spirit based on the strength of your territory at the time of the summoning. As such, Lionel's territory gained 3 large spirit animals with the strength of about 100,000 gold-grade threats. This didn't mean that they were 100,000 times stronger than a gold-grade threat, but rather that it would take the all-out attack of that many gold-grade threats over the course of a few hours to take them down. After he did this, Lionel raised a hand and little black star seemed to appear from nowhere, landing on his palm and snaking up toward his neck in a hurry. Lionel smiled and rubbed the little guy's head. Little black star seemed to have reached his maximum size. Even after entering the 7th dimension, he didn't grow past 2 to 3 feet long. The way he draped over Lionel smiled and rubbed the little guy's head. Little black star seemed to have reached his maximum size. Even after entering the 7th dimension, he didn't grow past 2 to 3 feet long. The way he draped over Lionel's shoulders wasn't much different from a thick scarf. We're gonna wreak some havoc, Black Star. Yip. Yip. Black Star trembled and suddenly wrapped around Lionel with great speed, becoming nothing more than a blur of black before a large amount of dark force to shape into a prowling black dragon. Little Black Star sat in its forehead, clearly visible, until the dark force became so thick and viscous that he vanished entirely. The creature opened its mouth and roared. At that moment, the entire Air Wars moon trembled and quaked. The slowly darkening skies seemed to suddenly enter the depths of night in a single step. Little Blackstar raised a claw and planted it on the sturdy gold-grayed walls, raising his head to the skies as he continued to bellow. The war cry reached the ears of the heirs across the two continents, even piercing into the ocean waters and causing the waves to rise and rock. Lionel's figure flickered, and he appeared on Little Blackstar's head. His aura soared, a piercing spear howl becoming the only point of light in the skies. The soul constructs below shifted and stomped, the echo of their footsteps fusing into Little Blackstar's roar, and Lionel's spear howl. A radiant halo appeared above Lionel's head, descending down his body and forming a vibrant armor that shook with vital star form. The towering sky blue and gold standing amidst a mass of deep and impregnable, roaring black made the man atop of the world the center of attention. Decisive. This was the only word the elders of the human domain could think. They could see everything Lionel could see, and with their experience, they knew well what thoughts he must have in his head at this moment. But rather than trying to tuck away until he had victory 100% confirmed, he chose this route instead. To try and confirm victory would underestimate the geniuses of the human domain far too much. While Lionel was advantaged now, he had his weaknesses. They had already seen that he had limitations in terms of both subordinate count and subordinate strength. If he didn't take advantage of his lead now, he might never get the chance. The Morales family elders nodded. Lionel had not only proved them wrong several times, but he also knew when to not go against the majority's thoughts and take the most logical route, even when that most logical route, like this time, took a great deal of wisdom to take. At the same time, the worry on the brows of the other elders deepened. However, no matter how much they wanted to reach into the glass cube and put a stop to it, Lionel's army began to march, their momentum stifling. They didn't try to hide themselves in the slightest. No amount of preparation on their enemies' part would matter. Their only outcome would be to be steamrolled. To the west, the Pisk and Quarius families looked up. Just as Lionel had expected, they were already making their move into the ocean, claiming several seaside territories as they began to look for their first underwater territory. What was surprising, though, was that these two constellation families were actually working together. But when one thought about it, this was less surprising in reality. The best genius of the Quarius family, Queen Beauty Vega Quarius, had joined First Nova. Without anyone to take up the reins, the Quarius family was reeling. Rather than simply not participating, though, they preferred to team up with the Pisk family. Together, as the two prominent water force families, they made a plan to conquer the oceans. However, hearing the roar, their gazes couldn't help but narrow. The leader of the Pisk, Marina, and the current leader of the Quarius, Vega's younger sister, Pearl, both seemed to react at the same time, their expressions solemn. They began to gather up their subordinates, sending out calls for returns as well, shoring up their defenses and looking toward the towering spear howl in the distance as a mass of violet moved toward them swiftly. By this point, their numbers were already well in the thousands, but even between the two of them, they only had about 100,000 or so subordinates, and that was after focusing everything on getting as many kill exchanges as possible. This mass of enemies. How would they deal with this? Chapter 1970. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:05 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1970. Humans. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1970 humans. Seeing their numbers, Lionel knew that he had made the right decision. As he had expected, after a certain point, the number of subordinates the heirs and the others could accumulate would only increase exponentially. It was just simple math. A single person could only get one kill exchange at the same time, multiplying themselves to 2. But 2 people could get 4, and 4 could get 8. Of course, the Quarius and Pisk families were still a bit of an anomaly. They had focused entirely on gathering up as many people as possible because their goal was the ocean. With the depth and vastness, they needed numbers to explore and press their advantage. Lionel felt that this was the wrong approach, and he would likely be proved right by those who had focused on other things having numbers that were comparable enough. but their mistakes had nothing to do with him. Within an hour, it crushed them. Lionel had steamrolled over every small faction on the way here, sending the oryx he came across back to rest and ordering them to circle around and support the Tor family. His momentum was already at its peak when he waved a hand and gripped his black rod, raising it into the skies. Right then, a wall destruction reward surged forward. The others had accumulated 3 of these total, and though they could only be used against silver-grade territories and below. Who other than Lionel had a gold-grade territory? The expressions of Marina and Pearl changed immediately, but there was nothing they could do. They leapt into the air, dodging out of the way of the crumbling walls as their city was exposed to the masses. Lionel's spear raised its apex and little Blackstar opened his jaws, his chest expanding. The latter's head stretched over 100 meters into the skies, his preparation causing the air to shake and quake. Suddenly, roar! A billowing cyclone of darkness surged out from his gaping mouth, tearing a path toward the crumbling wall. Marina and Pearl's expressions changed once again. They had vaguely felt that the creature beneath Lionel should have just been a construct, but when it attacked, they were taken completely off guard. Was that really a dragon? They had only heard myths about such beasts. There should have been any real occurrences of them. Damn it! Marines pulled at a silk fabric wrapped around her slender waist. Pearl reacted at the same time, pulling out a tall, blue-scaled trident. The two rushed forward, looking to block the Black Breath attack. Although they felt it was still manageable, they didn't want the battle to start with such devastating losses. While they were capable of dealing with it, that didn't mean that the others were. As the two heirs, they had to take this sort of burden on their shoulders. However, before they could even properly, Lionel's rod expanded, blotting out the skies as it descended in a torrent of rotating spear force. Lionel unleashed a furious roar that resonated with little Blackstars, his blue vital star force turning a furious red, then instantly a vibrant violet as he activated star fusion. King's Might. The two young women attacked, but found themselves meeting an immutable wall. With his spear domain lineage factor activated, Lionel's spear passed through little Blackstar's roar as though it wasn't there at all, not interfering with it in the slightest. But the same couldn't be said for the two women. They were blown backward, their gazes helpless as they watched little Blackstar's dark force breath shred everything in its path. What made them shudder instantly was that they realized they had underestimated little Blackstar far too much. The attack had felt manageable just now, but when it descended, it swallowed up all the force in its path, gathering it into its strength and continuing forward. It was like anarchic force. Lionel rose into the skies, allowing Blackstar to wreak havoc below as he reached out a hand. The tidal wave of soul constructs surged forward into the remaining shambles of the army. Even when they managed to kill a soul construct, another one would take its place while the one that had fallen would reform and join the battle once again. The morale of the Pisk and Quarius families plummeted, but Lionel only kept churning away at them, his forward momentum relentless. Not even an hour later, there was nothing but ruins. Corpses littered the ground and the territory was swallowed up. At that moment, the borders of Lionel's territory expanded, pushing past the barrier that had once been there, and taking this land for itself. At that moment, streaks appeared from the horizon. Aina, James, Noah, Emna, Raylion, Hephaestus, his brothers and the other geniuses of Earth caught up one after another. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. He shifted the direction of the army, his mind swirling with the images of the boundaries he had seen before. After settling the direction, he began to press forward with an even faster pace. He had 13 hours left to maximize these 3 million troops. He would destroy everything he could. Dancing red gold flames lit his pupils. The commotion that Lionel had caused wasn't small, however there was a reason he didn't try to hide his tracks. Firstly, the commotion of his gold grade upgrade wasn't small. Million charging with 7th dimensional strength was bound to cause a great tidal wave across the moon. Secondly, he wanted to impose his will. This was precisely what had happened. Although ganging up and defeating a powerful enemy sounded logical, humans were selfish. Before it was necessary, they would bide their time and hope someone else dealt with it while they benefited. And with the strategic placement of the Cloud Race members, Lionel could nudge things in the direction. With everyone holing up, all of his targets were in just a single place, and very quickly, the scouts of the Libra family rushed with news of his actions. Third chapter is coming, but maybe much later. Chapter 1971. Published at 28th of June, 2023, 1:05 and 57 seconds p.m. Chapter 1971. Kiza, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1971. Kiza, Juan, Droit, Hewlett and Druid all looked forward with shock. Listening to the report of their subordinate, they didn't know how to react immediately. They had upgraded their main territory to the silver grade not long ago, and they were preparing to continue their momentum swiftly as they approached the appropriate time to unleash their trump card and deal with Lionel. But they didn't expect that Lionel would react before they could. To the side, Kiza, the heir of the Gamine family, a young woman that Lionel had met and clashed with during the true selection of the Void Palace. Back then, Kiza had taken interest in Lionel because her mother had been one of the many to fall for his father, Velasco. She was very curious to learn about that man through Lionel, mostly because her mother was a woman she couldn't see falling for anyone. Of course, that included her father, who she had little to no respect for. It could be said that Kiza took after her mother in her disregard for most men. Unfortunately, she didn't get the chance to probe Lionel as much as she had wanted, as the true selection had been too hectic back then. Not to mention the cataclysm that occurred not long afterward. However, hearing about his movements now, her interest had suddenly returned. In truth, she didn't think of Lionel much, and decades had passed since then. She was surprised, though, when the Libra family chose to change up their original plans by moving their cooperation up. When she learned that it was because of Lionel and the fact he had already taken out Nazag, she became even more intrigued. Her eyes couldn't help but narrow, a playful smile spreading across her vibrant pink lips. What do we do? How did he gather millions of subordinates already? Juan spoke with furrowed brows. It's not millions of subordinates. Kiza suddenly spoke. Their heads turned toward her all at once. Although she had a playful smile on her face, they didn't take it as a joke. Kiza looked like an airhead, but in terms of intelligence, she was ranked amongst the best of the human domain. There was a long time before Lionel had done it that many believed that if anyone were to surpass the scorned Queen Beauty on the Void Library's leader list, it would be her. But for whatever reason, Kiza had never bothered to enter the Void Library. Their soul constructs. You people really have no idea how the soul works. TSK. Hewlett and Druid, the two female Libra family members, were very much annoyed by Kiza's antics. But Juan and Droit, who had practically grown up with her, were already wrapped around her little finger. Despite their genius, they practically just did as she pleased, which was also why it was so surprising to Kiza when they contacted her to change their original plans. Much like Wise Star Order had told Lionel all those years ago, the Gamine family was the only family of the human domain with any true understanding of the soul, and that was because their lineage factor allowed them far more free range than most humans. As such, when Kiza had sensed the unique fluctuations in some of the battles Lionel had fought, she had already sensed the uniqueness. Now hearing that he had suddenly manifested millions of subordinates, she put two and two together. Soul constructs? Where would he get so many soul constructs? By killing, of course. The group of four frowned. They didn't understand. Kiza shrugged. I'm very curious about certain things. The person who fascinates me more is Eleanor Morales. I really wanted to know what about her was so much better than my mother, so I investigated her. She has a very uncanny ability to use soul constructs, and this was obviously passed down to her little boy. Although Kiza was smiling, Juan and Droit looked away from her gaze, feeling a cold shiver down their backs. The two had had a crush on Kiza for the longest time, but they had never bothered to pursue her. That was because this woman had no heart. If that cold lump of coal in her chest opened up for anyone, it was her mother and her mother alone. Often, that love crossed a line that mother and daughter shouldn't have, and it also turned into a level of fanaticism that led to results like this. Although Kiza was speaking casually, The amount of killing intent she was exuding was palpable. There was no doubt she wanted to kill Eleanor. Even so, that doesn't explain where he would get so many soul constructs. Also, if he could get millions of kill exchanges, why wouldn't he exchange them for real people? Druid and Hewlett, who didn't understand Kiza as well, asked with questioning tones. Their two cousins shuddered but didn't say anything. Can't you Libras use your heads? There are two of you and you practically share all thoughts. Shouldn't that make you smarter? First of all, using soul constructs wouldn't necessarily stop you from using kill exchanges, they're mutually exclusive. Secondly, where would he get millions of subordinates from? He entered the Air War games later than anyone. Earth is still too weak to produce so many seventh-dimensional experts, while the Morales wouldn't provide him with such support for the sake of fairness. If I'm correct, he's probably already converted all of his kills into points by now. As for where he would get millions of kill exchanges, that's even more obvious. What is the easiest way to gain kill exchanges? Their eyes suddenly widened and they stood to their feet. Gold grade? Already? How is that possible? The hearts of the Libra family shook. To clear the gold grade, one had to have the equivalent of millions of subordinates. Even if they were soul constructs, didn't gaining those soul constructs mean that Lionel had such means already? Why was Kiza so casual about this? How do we deal with this? Kiza leaned back and reclined. What do you mean, how do we deal with this? We don't. We are on opposite sides of the supercontinent. His soul constructs won't last the trip all the way over here. Don't you think it's about time the Nova brothers clashed? Let them wear each other down. Kiza took a sip of a drink and closed her eyes. Juan and Droit looked toward one another. They knew Kiza better than anyone. If there was anyone who took Lionel's words the most personally, it was her. She seemed carefree, but she was the most arrogant person they knew. Lionel claiming that he would kill as many as he saw was probably the one thing that actually made her take these air wars seriously. And when Kiza was serious, she didn't have just one plan, she had at least three. As for what those other two were, until the moment they were revealed, maybe no one but her would know. There was maybe nothing more dangerous than a scorned woman. Though if one said such a thing to Kiza, she would probably kill them without the slightest hesitation. If the person she hated most was Eleanor, the person she hated the second most was none other than the queen-scorned beauty. Chapter 1972. Published at 3rd of July, 2023, 8:21 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 1972. Agreement: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1972 Agreement: a tide of violet swept through the dayside supercontinent. Nothing could seem to stop it. Lionel and Little Blackstar took the vanguard, causing death and destruction. Every time they took action, the opposing armies were thrown into chaos and disorder. After they were finished, the strongest of Lionel's subordinates would rush over, splitting up the most powerful combatants, and stopping them from having the opportunity to support the more average fights. Then the army of millions would swoop in. The army of soul constructs was relentless. They maintained the same savage air that they had during the upgrade challenge, their bloodthirst often overwhelming the enemies before them. Even when one managed to hold their ground and fight back, witnessing one rise back from the dead, as though they had never been harmed in the first place, was enough to shatter even the strongest morale. By the time half of Lionel's 13 or so hours were through, his territory had already expanded by as much as 30%, and the hold he had over the dayside supercontinent had begun to approach as much as 60%. He suffocated and suppressed the other territories, and his blade never seemed to show mercy. Given the circumstances, his kill rate had dropped from 100% of heirs. It couldn't be helped. Some didn't have the fortitude to stay until the final moments, or the stupidity, depending on how you looked at it. One after another, heirs abandoned their chances at glory and vanished. When they appeared on the glass cube once again, they gasped for breath, their expressions pale and their gazes flickering with fear. In those moments, they had truly felt the scent of death. Seeing the states, flashes of pity couldn't help but spark in the eyes of their elders. True death was one thing, but this sort of death of the heart was another kind altogether. The image of Lionel, standing loftily atop the back of a roaring black dragon, was simply far too much for them to handle. Maybe in their lifetimes, they would never be able to raise their heads and face Lionel as equals. In this lifetime, they could only submit. Noah fought valiantly on the battlefield. His saber was bold and his courage was commendable. However, he could only feel that the gap between him and Lionel only seemed to be widening. Much like the elders of the human domain, he too had sensed the fork in the road that Lionel had just faced, and quite frankly, if it had been up to him, he wasn't sure if he would have chosen to take this route. Things seemed to be going smoothly now, but Lionel's current actions, his boldness, his trumpeting victories, was only provoking others. It seemed like a simple choice to use an army of millions to face off against groups that were only a few 10,000 at most, but that was only surface-level analysis from those with little understanding of military affairs and war. Noah had spent much of his life on the battlefield, and he knew Lionel wasn't a fool. One of the worst things a military commander could do was to overextend themselves, and there were very strong arguments for the fact that this was what Lionel was doing right this moment. Even so, he stood in the skies with a cold expression. Every time they conquered a territory, he would snatch its city core and leave it ruins. Then, as though it was an adequate replacement, he would leave behind an outpost and move on without a word. He continued to grind away at his enemies, making bold move after bold move. Noah could see that some fatigue was already accumulating along Lionel's brow, but the latter didn't seem to notice. It wasn't a simple task to just reform the destroyed soul constructs. Every time he did so, another bit of his stamina would be sapped away. Although his stars could quickly replenish it, he was wasting more than he was recovering. Even so, the fact that Lionel could sustain millions of soul constructs at all was a great shock. A slight fatigue after what should have been doing something impossible for most was far too difficult to fathom. And yet it was happening right before them all. Seeing Lionel crush the dreams of one heir after another. Though the conflict within Noah's heart only continued to grow, he truly couldn't understand the difference. Were some people simply born better? He knew about Lionel's life. He knew that Lionel was a normal teen of the entertainment stream for most of his life. Other than being a 5-star professional, there was nothing special about him. Whereas he had been a prince of the empire from the day he was born. He had the best teachers, the best resources, the best training. So why was he so inferior? The harsh reality was that Noah knew that Lionel agreed with him as well, not just Lionel, but even his own grandfather. Lionel had always thought he was better than others. The difference was that he felt this betterness was superficial and not enough to calculate the worth of a person. As such, he was determined to use the fact he was simply born better than others to help those around him, and create a world where such heartache wasn't necessary. This was why he had always taken these burdens on his shoulders, why he had wanted to be a king and not an emperor. Although his ruthlessness had increased in recent times and his views had shifted somewhat, this was still the very foundation of his being. Emperor Fox, however, was a bit more difficult to read. Even so, his actions seemed to state that he didn't care much about the world at all. He got rid of the useless, slaughtering them en masse. His true goals and aspirations were unknown, but it was safe to say that he wanted to maximize the growth of his empire, even if it meant sacrificing innocence. As for whether there was a deeper layer to that story, only he would know. The irony to Noah, though, was that these two men that he respected greatly, both of them agreed on a fundamental level. There were simply certain barriers one couldn't overcome without being born with a certain advantage others didn't have. The army came to a slow halt. In the distance, the flag of a silver-grade city with walls even taller than Lionel's gold-grade city appeared. 5th Nova's territory. Chapter 1973. Published at 3rd of July, 2023, 8:21 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 1973. Only as good. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1973. Only as good. The armies of 5th Nova had long since prepared, but it wasn't the armies that had made Lionel pause. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the tall walls. He still had 2 wall collapsing exchanges that he hadn't used yet. He simply hadn't run into any enemies that were worth the effort. The Pisk and Quarius families had been the only ones that made the loss worthwhile. But now he realized even without trying that the remaining two that he had wouldn't work now. These walls weren't built by a mysterious system. They were almost certainly built by Fifth Nova and his subordinates. They were several times more powerful than a gold-grade wall, and were probably more powerful than even the air-grade walls would be. One shouldn't take the pre-generated walls lightly. Even the subgrade wall had taken a combined effort of Lionel and Aina resonating their attacks to take it down in one strike. The difference between each subsequent grade of wall was only more exaggerated. During Lionel's battle with Nazag, his territory had been too small to accommodate everyone, and as such they had gathered outside. Plus their walls had only been at the subgrade and not very useful. When he fought with Armand, their village had only been at the bronze grade and they faced a similar problem with Nazag. Plus, Lionel had descended from the skies back then, making it difficult for even those walls to have much use. However, upon reaching the silver grade, dropping down from the skies was already an impossible workaround as the walls came formulated with a built-in formation that protected both around and above. At the gold grade, this formation was obviously even stronger, and as such, Ramon's self-created walls were even more devastating on the defensive front. Lionel stopped the army because he knew no amount of forward momentum would be able to crush what was before him. He would only waste stamina going headlong without thinking. He couldn't help but silently nod to himself. Indeed, he wasn't the only person in the air wars with such grand methods. He didn't have a monopoly on force crafting or scheming. His fifth cousin was the most silent of the bunch, allowing Valerie to take the reins, but as a man born with both the metal synergy and spear domain lineage factor, he had his own strengths. At that moment, atop the tall silver walls, a young woman, wearing bronze armor and wielding a spear that looked a lot more like a glaive with a blade half the size of her body, appeared. Lionel recognized her at a glance as Valerie. From what Lionel understood, she was one of the last to be born in his father's generation. But in reality, she only counted as such because she was born to parents of his grandfather's generation. The truth was that she couldn't be considered to be a part of the Nebula or Nova generation. Lionel knew very little about her, but of what he did know he understood that she was very unsatisfied with the current Air Wars system. She had only been born with the spear domain lineage factor, and as such, hadn't had the right to participate. It also didn't help that she was born sort of in between generations, making the logistics even more difficult on her. Members of the Morales family weren't technically allowed to participate in the Air Wars, so that it didn't seem that the family was supporting one over the other. In addition, this rule minimized infighting and maximized the cohesiveness of the group. Even if a few heirs butted heads, there would be no deaths, and because their family branches wouldn't be involved, the grudges would be at a minimum. However, Valerie had become Ramon's wife, and as a result she was granted a unique exception. Even amongst the Morales family, rumors couldn't help but spread. A strong woman like Valerie was obviously well known, and her fierce personality was even more so. Everyone had thought that she would end up with a man even more headstrong than she was, but to end up with the silent Ramon of all people, no one could have expected such a result, until they suddenly understood. If Valerie was going to fulfill her dream of becoming the heir apparent of the Morales family, who would be a better puppet than Ramon? He was silent, closed off, and even his own family knew very little about him. From the thoughts of others, Valerie strong-arming Ramon into marriage was an easy feat, Valerie being Valerie, though never cared to address those rumors. Anyone she caught talking about such things would just taste her blade, and that would be the end of it. Now, however, Valerie stood on top of the walls, her gaze narrowed and sharp. She had been expecting to see a Nova on the other side, but she hadn't expected it to be Seventh Nova. If Valerie was honest, she quite liked Lionel. He had given the Morales family a great deal of face with his attitude. Although she was worried that he had spoken a bit too arrogantly and might end up falling hard because of that, the fact that he was here seemed to mean that he had backed up a lot of what he had to say. Even so, seeing that they were enemies now, it didn't dull her blade in the slightest. In fact, it made it stronger. Little Black Star moved forward until his shadow loomed over the city. By this point, the moon was looming high in the skies, But with Blackstar's appearance, his head overshadowed it, casting a mighty darkness over the city. At this moment, many of Fifth Nova's subordinates had been resting, but upon hearing the commotion, they immediately lined up. They had known that something was coming, but even so, they had slept like babies. With a single glance, Lionel could see just how well trained these warriors were, and the look of respect they gave toward Valerie was an even more striking sign. Archers lined the walls and prepared for battle. They all held real bows and powerful arrows. Lionel knew that even if he crushed their bow force, the power of the crafts backing them would be enough to do some real damage. A single one of those arrows could kill a gold-grade threat. If they sent volley after volley, within a few minutes he would be drained of dream force even if he revived them all. Lionel analyzed the situation quite quickly. There was no doubt that this would be his greatest challenge since stepping foot into the air wars. Even so, his gaze was calm. Little Blackstar lowered his head until Lionel was eye level with Valerie. He smiled slightly for the first time since entering this place. It was clear that he treated them far differently than he did the others he had come across. I guess I should call you Big Sis, right? Let's have a good battle. These walls, though. I'm afraid they aren't enough. Valerie's gaze softened somewhat before they sharpened once again into a sneer. She raised her spear and pointed it at Lionel's head, but at the same time, Lionel had raised his arms, his left kidney beginning to shine with a burning glow. A formation is only as good as its weaknesses, Lionel said softly. Within the core of the city, Ramon's eyes suddenly snapped open. Chapter 1974. Published at 3rd of July, 2023, 8:21 and 40 seconds AM. Chapter 1974. Weaknesses. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1974 Weaknesses. Lionel Iris's danced with complex runes that fused and separated before fusing once more. A great feeling of danger suddenly took hold of Valerie, and she felt like something she should stop was about to happen. But before she could, dozens of fireballs appeared in the skies, the temperature skyrocketing as they descended quicker than Valerie could react. Bang, 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 bang. There didn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to the descending balls of fire, but every collision caused a quake that rocked the city. By the time the third had descended, the invisible barrier had taken shape and become very real, cracks spreading across its transparent surface. By the time the sixth descended, the walls had begun to shake as well, their structural integrity seemingly in jeopardy. Then suddenly, all of the remaining over dozen descended at once. The reaction was immediate. The invisible barrier cracked like glass, motes of light descending from above in a beautiful, yet tragic sort of way. The balls of fire only continued to rain downward, setting fire to the city and laying waste to much of what was in its path. Valerie's expression changed. She understood Ramon's skill quite well. By this point, he had already overshadowed many of the older generation in terms of his force crafting. There shouldn't have been anyone amongst the heirs that was his match in this regard, and that was only further proven by the gold-grade armors that fitted each and every one of their warriors. Ramon hadn't slept a single wink since the air wars began. Even though the fatigue had set in for him long ago, he only continued to press forward. Valerie had seen his hard work personally, and she knew how meticulous he was. There was simply no way he would have made any large mistakes that could be so easily explored. In that case, the only explanation was that Lionel was just far superior to him. The only thing stopping Lionel from forging true eighth-dimensional treasures currently was a lack of force strength and little Tali's limitations. He had already stepped through the boundary of the life grade, and the gap between that and the gold grade could only be said to be enormous. There was simply no other explanation. What Ramon saw was a perfect construction, one that he had poured his blood and sweat into. In terms of gold grade constructions, it was probably among the best possible, period. However, what Lionel saw was a construct that wasn't whole. The definition of the life grade wasn't a level of strength. Rather, it represented a product that was so perfectly synergized that it seemed to have life, a product so perfect that it seemed as though the universe itself had created it. Ramon's construction, however, was far from that. And to Lionel, every point of imperfect synchronization was only another weakness. A weakness that could be exploited. Despite the change, Valerie reacted quickly. Fire at will. Her roar echoed across the skies. The archers raised their bows, but with a flicker of Lionel's radiant crown, their bow force winked out one after another. Before the archers could respond to the change, Lionel's brothers, Aina and the others charged. Little Blackstar whipped his tail out just once, and they were all sent flying with great speed toward the walls. The moment they landed, a catastrophe seemed to have descended, and the archers were thrown into complete disarray. Lionel reached out a palm and leapt forward. A black rod billowing dense fog darker than even the night sky appearing in his hand as he swung down toward Valerie. Though Valerie was shocked, she pivoted once more. She slid a foot back, gliding into an attack stance before piercing out toward Lionel's chest. If her attack landed, there was no doubt Lionel wouldn't even get the chance to step onto the walls. Lionel's gaze narrowed. What a perfect spear strike. Valerie's skill had returned to simplicity. Unfortunately. What good was a spear against Lionel? Just as Lionel had this thought, though Valerie's spear strike smoothly turned into a javelin's throw, a strong bronze force coating it as she threw it. She had known long ago that Lionel had the spear domain ring and had lured him forward as such on purpose, lulling him with a false sense of security. Lionel's expression flickered. She hadn't used any spear force, and even if her spear crumbled, the force surrounding it definitely wouldn't. It was already too late to change his spear trajectory, but with a thought, 2 more stars appeared to Lionel's back. 10 stars shone with radiant splendor, 3 silver, 3 sky blue, 2 red gold and 2 dark ocean blue. His aura changed and reached its peak, the presence of the heavenly body realm finally shining forth in full effect. Ever since he had shifted his perspective on universal force, this was the very first time Lionel had unleashed it fully. Before, the aura of universal force was far too subtle, as it could only be displayed when he brought forth all of his stars. But now, there was no denying it. The human domain was shocked once more. They had never seen a heavenly body realm like this. A heavenly body realm that was so perfect, so powerful. Void Star Force descended and formed a force art before Lionel that quickly solidified into a shield. The moment the force art was completed, more runes formed within his 2 Void Star Force stars, strengthening them once more, but he didn't seem to notice at all as his spear continued to descend toward Valerie. Valerie's pupils constricted. She was still in a throwing motion. She wasn't in any condition to counterattack. She could only raise her forearm. But right then, an action that looked like a desperate attempt shifted. The slots in her armor's forearm opened up and formed a round shield, meeting Lionel's spear tip head-on. Bang! Valerie was sent flying, her body streaking through the air like a shooting star. You're tuning in to the Lee May's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.